म्यूट में होता है ना, तो बीच बीच में आवाज आती रहती है। यूट्यूब पे इशू होता है ना उसका। ठीक है, अभी फर्स्ट क्लास है।
Okay, now we are formally going to start this program. Good afternoon to all the participants, and welcome to a symposium on non-fictional prose writing being organized by the Sahitya Akademi under its Webline literature series. We have a panel of 5 very eminent scholars consisting of Professor Anita Singh, Dr. Vasudhara Roy, Professor Malati Mathur, Dr. Nishikolo, Professor Sachidananda Mohanty, Professor Shymati Mukherjee, and Dr. Usha Bande. And this session will be chaired by none other than Professor Anisur Rahmanji. And before I request Professor Rahman to chair the session and invite the speakers one by one to present their papers, let me briefly introduce him. Professor Rahman is a literary critic, translator, and a bilingual poet. Formerly a professor of English at Jamia Millia Islamia, a central university in New Delhi, and senior advisor at Rekhta Foundation, the world's largest website on Urdu language, literature, and culture. He has worked and published in the areas of comparative translation, post-colonial, and Urdu studies. He has, to his credit, 4 books authored by him, 6 edited / co-edited volumes, an anthology of his English poems, and 2 collections of Urdu poetry in English translation. Professor Rahman has been a Shastri Fellow at the University of Alberta, Canada from 2001 to 2002 and a visiting scholar at Purdue University, USA in the year 2007. Sir, we also request you to say a few words and give your comments as chair at the end of the session. And now over to you, Professor Rahman sir. Sir, audio खोलिए अपना.
I have already opened this. Yes. Thank you, Varma Saab. Thanks a lot for thinking of this symposium and also for bringing the very distinguished speakers today. Thanks and also to you because we often think of other genres. We often don't think of the non-fiction prose writings, which is so very important. As surveys tell us that the maximum number of books published are in the non-fiction genres. And the maximum number of books sold everywhere, including America, because there's an American study which says that the maximum number of books that are published and sold belong to the genres, various genres of non-fiction. Ironically enough, we haven't been often talking about non-fiction. We have talked of other genres and other forms of poetry and of prose. So most welcome, dear participants and very distinguished participants who are here, 7 of them who are here. So I have a pleasure in welcoming you all and saying thanks to Sahitya Akademi for bringing us together today. As we are aware that life writing and memoirs and travelogues and letters and philosophical writings and constructions of history all come under this fold of non-fiction prose. Other words, everything that doesn't have any amount of fiction whatsoever falls in this category. Therefore, we have a wide range to discuss about, to talk and think about. And we have 7 speakers here who are going to speak from different angles, starting from biography to autobiographies to travelogues and other constructions of history, etc. So there is no imaginative interpolation in the kinds of writings that we are going to discuss today. And all the 7 speakers who are together today will be taking up different kinds of texts that have engaged their attention during the recent past, and they will be talking about that since they have also researched in those areas. It's an open field, very, very wide and open field for the scholars who have assembled here, and they can start their batting in a while. So these scholars are all very eminent in their own areas of studies. The format would be like this. Let me just briefly say about this format. That may I request all of you to devote 13 to 15 minutes in your presentations. We have 2 hours and 30 minutes, but if you go it in a very programmed manner, we shall be able to deliver better. So let's limit our presentation to 13 to 15 minutes. Then 20 minutes we shall keep for discussion, interaction with each other, because that's an important part of any kind of a symposium or seminar. And we shall have some time also, about 15 minutes for interaction, apart from interaction for prelims as it is now going on, as for summing up. Before I start, let me also say that during this pandemic, I think we haven't been meeting as frequently earlier. We haven't met as frequently earlier as we haven't met during the past 1 year. So this is one of the boons, apart from the many banes that we have had, that we have been able to get together and we have been able to exchange our ideas and to come together and to discuss our issues that we have been studying all these years. To begin with, let's go according to the list that is there given to us, and we begin with Professor Anita Singh from BHU. Professor Anita Singh is a recipient of Fulbright Nehru Visiting Scholar Fellowship at the University of Virginia, which is a very prestigious kind of a thing. She has been a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, and her recent publications include Staging Feminism, Gender, Violence and Performance in Contemporary India, which is done by Routledge, another very prestigious publication. She has 2 edited volumes also, Gender, Space and Resistance, and Hero and Hero Worship, Fandom in Modern India. Very interesting title. She has completed a major research project of ICSSR of staging gender, performing women, and Ramlila of Ramnagar. This is of particular interest to me because once I wrote something on Kajri, and there I discussed this Ramlila of Ramnagar and other things. So that is of a special interest to me. Professor Anita Singh is also the president of Asian African Association for Women, Gender and Women, Gender and Sexuality. So may I have the pleasure of inviting Professor Singh to make her presentation, and we shall keep to the time frame so that we can listen to each other very well and then discuss. Over to you, Professor Anita Singh.
Thank you so much, Professor Rahman, for the kind introduction. So before I begin, I would like to extend my greetings to the Secretary of Sahitya Akademi, K. Srinivasan Rao, to the convener of the English Advisory Board, Professor Sanjukta Das Gupta, to Mr. Jyoti Krishna Verma, who has been coordinating with us all along, and the chairperson of this webinar, Professor Anisur Rahman, and all my co-panelists. So I would like to share my screen, and I would definitely stick to my time. I hope.
We have already permitted. Yes.
Yeah. No, sorry. No, I want to share my, okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so with this, I'll begin my presentation, and hopefully I will not overstep my time. If I do that, please feel free to, interrupt me. So as you can see, the topic of my presentation is Seeing from the Margins of Space, Identity at the Intersection of Caste, Gender and Sexual Orientation. So this presentation will examine how the gendered self is fashioned by spatial gendered power relation in a multitude of everyday contexts. I have here curated a small list, which is by no means exhaustive, of non-fictional Indian works that deepen our understanding of gender issues in India. It is no coincidence that most of these works are autobiography. This work also underlines the fact that the term gender, or the journey of the term gender, from being synonymous to women to be now mobilized as politics of caste, class, sexuality, and other intersections and contradictions inherent in these categories. I have selected these diverse writings so that many different truths about, experiences of gendered experiences emerge from these.
Anita ji, I am sorry. Can I interrupt you for a minute?
Sure.
What the screen is showing is my own email, not your any of your document.
That is what I was.
Yeah, please correct it.
Okay, wait, I'll do it once more. I don't know why. That is why I asked you. So stop share. I'll share it once more.
I am not able to view anyone. So has everybody switched off their video?
Now is it
Yeah,
visible?
now it is all right. Now it is all right.
Thank you. I can start now.
Yeah.
Has everyone switched off their video?
No.
Because I can't view anyone except what Anita is sharing.
Okay, actually, maybe there's some issue with your network. You know, it will come eventually.
Yeah, so
sometimes
maybe I should reconnect. Okay, please. I'm sorry to have interrupted you, Anita. I'm sorry. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
I'll continue. As long as you can hear me. So these are the three autobiographies I am taking up. One is by Nalini Jamila, Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi, and Baby Kamble. So the overarching idea that is deployed here is that the conceptualization of space embeds patriarchal mechanisms of power using Doreen Massey's three significant propositions. Firstly, she proposes that space is a product of interrelation as constituted through interaction. Secondly, there is a plurality of coexisting entity at any given point of time, a coexisting heterogeneity. Thirdly, the production of space is never finished or complete, but it is constantly evolving and developing and changing, or it is dynamic. So the first voice that I take up is that of Nalini Jamila's. So her autobiography, The Autobiography of a Sex Worker, was first published in Malayalam in June 2005. It went on into 6 editions and has been translated into 8 different languages. It questioned many societal structures around sex, critiqued the divide of the public and private spaces, morality and immorality of work, the traditional good woman, bad woman dichotomy. The book's publication received its share of depreciation or denigration, you can say. Years back, if we can recall, Kamala Das had serialized her autobiography. The conservatives had maligned her for openly speaking about her body and sexuality. As for the reception of Jamila's work, the guardians of morality and some feminist group, usually at loggerheads with each other, took offense at what they saw as glorification of prostitution. The loudest protests perhaps came from the literary establishment. M. Mukundan, one of the well-known writers of contemporary Malayalam literature, he described the book as prurient money spinner. This misogyny was disguised as a concern for good reading habits. However, despite these critiques, the book garnered massive attention both nationally and internationally. The book challenges the dominant feminine ideal of the procreative, disciplined, family-centered, feminine image of what Partha Chatterjee terms as the new women. It contested the image of decay as the inevitable culmination of a sinful life, and instead it highlighted the ordinariness of sex work. The boundaries dividing workplace, home, the place of labor were quite fuzzy. In Jamila's insight, the threat of sexual violence is equally forwarding in all these disparate places, whether it is family, workplace, or the public spaces. Born in a middle-class Izawa families, Izawas are classified as the other backward class. In her book, she outlines the path of her life from that of a 9-year-old construction laborer to a sex worker and then to become an activist later in her life. Nalini reveals how family is a site of patriarchal control and power, and the ways through which even women become invested in patriarchal ideology. For instance, Nalini's father was influenced by his sister-in-law to abuse his wife. Later, this was replicated by her brother when he became the head of the family. At her workplace, the clay quarry where she worked, female workers were regularly sexually harassed. It was a part of the women's workers' duty to satisfy the needs of the contractors and the owners. Later in life, her association with the NGO Jwalamukhi enabled her to campaign for legal and medical protection for sex workers. She calls out for the double standards wherein only sex workers and not the clients are faced with social stigma, as if they exist in a kind of a detached bubble. She emphatically writes against the neo-colonial mindset modus operandi of all donor-ridden and projects of saving or rehabilitation. She completely rejects the idea that there's no saving required, but an acknowledgement of their existence. Her approach moves away from the abolitionist stand or to the pro-prostitution stand. She is much aware of the fact of the sexual exploitation that the women and girls through organized rings and she's also conscious of the difference in her situation and their situation. She calls finally at the end of her narrative, she calls for a legitimacy of the sex work and the workers to be recognized as any other profession, the right to their self-determination, and above all, their acceptance, an acceptance of them as human beings. So the next voice that I take up is that of Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi, also popularly known as Lakshmi. She's a transgender Hijra rights activist. She's a popular figure in media and culture. In her first autobiography that was titled Me Hijra, Me Lakshmi, she gave the readers an insight into her life and how she came to be Lakshmi. As an important text of queer literature, Lakshmi's autobiography unfolds 3 stages of Hijra identity: child sexual abuse, social seclusion from the normative gender domain, and Hijra's struggle for justice and social identity. Her second autobiography, which the content page you can see displayed on the screen, Red Lipstick, Men in My Life, she talks about the men who made an impact on her life. The book is arranged in sections, each focusing on certain people and aspects of her life. For example, there is a section called Raju's Monologue, referring to Lakshmi's childhood named Raju. From Ashok Rao Kavi, whom Lakshmi first met as a pubescent boy, to the guru who adopted her into the Hijra clan, to her father, brother, close associates, sexual, platonic, business, all relationships, they all figure here in what can be called a loosely connected self-narrative. Lakshmi was born as Raju with a set of male sexual organs, but never felt entirely like a man. She spent her early years riddled with confusion and angst. She was raped by her cousins, ostracized at school, lacked a sense of belonging. His gendered self was that of a girl, but his body parts were those of male. And then the whole issue of his sexuality. He was attracted to men. He donned the persona of Lakshmi later in life and embraced femininity. Butler's theory of performance provides an interesting lens through which we can view Lakshmi's narration, acting both as man and women according to her needs. It highlights the mismatch between biological sex, social gender roles, and behavioral attitude. These writings, whether it is Jamila or Lakshmi's writing, work on several scales as modes of self-making for the writer and for the reader, and also as tools for enabling recognition. She selects her own narrative. She selects her own definition. And at the end of the book, she writes, I'm a celebration, I feel, and that's the narrative I choose for my story. So with this, I move to the third voice, that is Baby Kamle's voice. Now, Baby Kamle's The Prison We Broke, as an autobiography, continually tries to engage with narratives of oppression and resistance. Gopal Guru in Afterward writes that unlike the autobiographical self in the West, the self here is partly constituted by life story and acquires larger meaning only in the context of the narrative of community. Sharmila Rege uses the term testimony interchangeably with autobiography. The idea of continuity between self and community is what is emphasized by both Gopal Guru and Sharmila Rege when they are talking about the epistemic resistance of the Dalit women. Baby Kamle begins her story with a very personal account of her love for her grandparents. She grew up with her brother in her grandparents' home in Veergaon, a taluk in Pune district of Maharashtra. Like an auto-ethnographer, Kamble depicts family life of the Mahars in great detail. The autobiography reveals a clear reference to the periphery where the writer says, our village is very beautiful, even though you don't see much by way of progress or anything like that here. We can also understand that this place is not touched by economic development and is literally devoid of schemes of public welfare. This world she paints is a world constituted by a difference of location. Difference located not only in geography, but also in the margins of social imaginary. caste and patriarchy perpetuate the exploitative practices against women. In spite of being a uniquely personal narrative, this also hints at the larger structure of oppression that women face on daily basis. In most of the instances that she narrates in her narrative, she uses "our" instead of "mine." She writes, "Our women offer their entire lives to the service of earth, but when they themselves become mother, what do they get?" The lived experience in this sense is pluralized rather than being confined solely to the individual's account. The oppressive intertwining of caste and patriarchy is revealed by the way men, upper caste women who lived outside the community, and sometimes even Mahar women themselves, inflicted humiliating experiences on other Mahar women. Baby Kamble narrates, "It was the essence of the Mahar women's life that was found sticking to the wood, yet the Brahmin women objected to what they saw sticking there." However, it would be a mistake to understand the self or the community of the Mahars that Baby Kamble talks about as passive recipient of oppressive structures. They were also constantly trying to resist and subvert these oppressive Brahmanical norms. In order to subvert this chain of humiliation, sometimes they purposefully touched the upper class children and ran away. At other times, they fought back by invoking myths glorifying Baba Sahib Ambedkar. Coming in contact with Ambedkar's words and teaching was a great revealing and liberating moment for Baby Kamble. And she writes, "I followed Baba's words verbatim to the best of my ability." So with this, I come to my last slide, the concluding slide. So these works, whether it is Nalini Jamila's autobiography or Lakshmi's autobiography or Baby Kamble's, these are all individual voices, obviously. But they are largely experiences of the diverse constructions of gendered body across caste, classes, regions, religions, and other categories. So a lived experience approach allows us to be open to competing interpretations, thereby not only illustrating the multidimensionality of what is constructed as a hegemonic fact, but also can in some ways script some resistance to it. Consequently, this presentation argued in favor of an intersectional praxis as a means of building coalitions across marginalities. As cultural texts, these books create liminal spaces where reimagination of cultural political praxis result in the growth of radical and inclusive politics, followed by engagement with issues of visibility and invisibility, hegemony and marginalization, articulation and silence. And finally, as literary and cultural performances, these autobiographies create a discourse which challenges existing literary structures through the articulation of caste, sex, and work discrimination. Thank you. So are we taking up questions after each presentation or at the end?
We'll take questions and comments later.
Okay, fine. Thank you. So that was all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Singh. We shall have questions and comments later, as I said just now. So we move on to the next presentation, which is by Dr. Vasudhara Roy. Let me add that out of the 7 participants who are here, she's the youngest and most, one of the brightest that I have seen in the recent past, as far as the younger generation goes. Thank you, Vasudhara, for being with us this afternoon. Vasudhara Roy is an assistant professor at Kareem City College, Jamshedpur, and she has been there for... Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So she has been there for a decade now, and she's an alumnus of Banaras Hindu University, and about which she has also written her poetry. And she has a PhD in diaspora studies, especially with reference to the women's writing. She works in the areas of diaspora studies, cultural studies, gender studies, and postmodern criticism. She has published a monograph of Migrations of Hope, a study of short fiction of 3 Indian American women writers. Very interestingly, she has 2 collections of poetry to her credit, Moon in My Teacup, a very imaginative title, as you can see. Another equally imaginative, which is Stitching a Home, which has a special meaning coming from a lady, coming from a young lady, and an academy. But Vasudhara is going to talk about authenticity, about decentering and non-fiction, and with reference to the prose writings of the Northeast India. Her talk is based on the book that Sahitya Akademi published, which is a collection of essays, which is a collection of writings on Northeast India. So she is centering on that, and she's trying to authenticate, to see, and to decenter how this in non-fiction prose, all these things come together. She will also going to talk about the mainstream discourse and the other discourse, which we'll of course talk about later, what we mean by main discourse and mainstream discourse and the alternate discourse, so to say. So may I invite you, Vasudhara, to make your presentation and keep the time frame in mind. Thank you. Please start.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much thank you, Sahitya Akademi, for inviting me, for organizing this wonderful panel. Thank you, Anita sir, for that very generous introduction. I'm very grateful to be here amidst a very erudite panel, which consists of people that I have read, I have learned from. Just presenting had been my very own teacher, Professor Anita Singh, and it's very glorious to be speaking in the same panel with her. Thank you very much. Is my presentation visible?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So as my topic goes, I'm going to talk about authenticity, decentering in nonfiction. And it's going to be an introduction to a book which has very recently been published by Sahitya Akademi, Prose Writings from Northeast India. Now, just, when we were beginning, Anita sir said that this is a wonderful topic to be speaking on because of most of the genres, nonfiction happens to be the most neglected. So talking about it, I believe that nonfiction, suffers from the consequences of its nomenclature. Mary Clearman Blue says that the boundaries of nonfiction will always be as fluid as water, but then that could be something which would be very detrimental for a genre to have no defined boundaries. I believe that the term nonfiction establishes its signification through an essential sense of lack. It identifies itself as something that is not fiction. So in this case, I believe that this nomenclature is quite problematic because it looks at fiction as a unified category, which is capable of producing a universal, singular, imaginative response. So fiction is supposed to be the norm, and anything that is not fiction then would be non-fiction. So it creates a kind of hierarchy where every writing that is deficient, so-called quality of fictionality, would then belong to this category of non-fiction. So there is something to be said for the marginality nomenclature itself allots to this genre. Now, if non-fiction is something which is not fiction, then the best way to define non-fiction would be to find out what fiction is, and therefore what non-fiction is not. So of the many definitions of fiction which are widely available, this is one definition that I like. This is from Peter Lamarck and Olsen's Truth Fiction, book 1994 publication. And it says that fiction is a mode of utterance which can only be identified when you identify with the utterance intention. So the person who creates fiction has a specific intention, and that specific intention is to evoke, something which is fictive. And we have to accept this fictive creation of the text produced. So anything that is fiction will have this quality of fictionalizing, fictionality, fictiveness, and non-fiction then would be a category which is devoid of this quality. Again, one very frequent observation that we find with regards to fiction and non-fiction is that fiction is supposed to be identified with a narrator. So the author is not speaking. It is technically the persona, the narrator within the fiction who is speaking. Whereas in non-fiction, there is no concept of a narrator. It is the author and solely the author who is identified as the narrator. So though narratology studies, have taken up nonfiction also within their purview, we find that most of the narratological studies, they deal with, a kind of pan-fictional attitude. They look upon everything as fiction, and the tools of fiction are used then to apply to nonfiction also. But nevertheless, they agree that nonfiction, it communicates, whereas fiction narrates. We find that, again, when you look closely at nonfiction, you find that there is basically, as the first definition began with, that its boundaries are as fluid as water. There is basically an idea that, nothing can be entirely fictional and nothing can be entirely devoid of fiction. So there are, cross borrowings, there are genre migrations that take place. But nevertheless, we find that there is, while fiction can easily migrate into the category of non-fiction, it is very difficult to say vice versa. So fiction can migrate into the category of non-fiction, and it can, proclaim its supremacy or a kind of credibility by saying that this fiction is based on real life events. However, if non-fiction tries to do the same, if it tries to fictionalize and foray into the boundaries of fiction, then it will be criticized for unreliability, for inauthenticity, and the author will be taken in for incompetence. So though we find that technically a genre migration is allowed, yet it is difficult for non-fiction to cross over and come into the boundaries of fiction. So for fiction, we talk about, for non-fiction, we talk about a certain set of qualities that are believed to be mandatory. So there should be consistency, it should have a particular scope and a relevance. So these four categories, precision, consistency, scope, and relevance, become important for nonfiction, because nonfiction is supposed to be entrusted with a responsibility in the world. It is responsible for reflecting the world as it is. So if, nonfiction means so much, because we can look we find all around us, nonfiction is ubiquitous. Everywhere, we are talking about nonfiction, it is everywhere, as Professor Rahman pointed out, it is on the bestseller lists. It is making it to, to longer shelves in every bookstore. So from the idea that nonfiction, is associated with a kind of nomenclatural marginality, could we try to shift the, perspective and think about nonfiction referring to ubiquity? So in that case, fiction is something which is a very small domain, and everything that is not fiction then would be nonfiction. So in that case, could we argue for a statistical, a larger, wider statistical range for nonfiction? Probably we could talk about this. Nonfiction, as sociologist Johann Goldsbaum writes, is a worldwide institution. In his opinion, the primary function of nonfiction literature is to talk about the world, is to present the world as it is in the widest possible sense of the word. So in nonfiction, both facts and context and perspective is very crucial. And Goldsbaum says that it is the combination of these that counts. If you look at the writings of South African poet Angie Crow, who also writes a considerable amount of nonfiction, in one of her interviews, she says that nonfiction writing is unearthing something, it is unearthing a life which has been unacknowledged, which has been unnoticed. And talking about the difference between fiction and nonfiction, she says that nonfiction is very much trying to figure out how to catch a fish. She gives us the image of catching a fish. So she says that the fish is important. It will feed our hunger. It is important for survival. But then we will not be able to catch the fish unless we know the embankment on which we are placed, unless we know the techniques of handling a fishing rod. So nonfiction equips us with these basic practical approaches. And then, comes the role of fiction, which is, as she says, to lift the fish out of the water for one incredible moment. So that is the role of fiction. And according to Klopp's definition, then, fiction is naturally secondary to nonfiction. So if nonfiction is so important and it is entrusted with such a huge onus, for reflecting the world as it is, for telling us more about the world that we inhabit, when we talk about nonfiction from marginal places, from marginal cultural communities, that becomes very significant. So nonfiction, when we talk about nonfiction from Northeast India, a large number of books these days, Northeast India has become almost the kind of, it is the hot seat among all publication subjects, and you will find a range of books on the subject which come out frequently. This is a set of 5 to 6 books that I happen to possess and I happen to have read, and which are very, very significant in illuminating the condition of Northeast Asia, its history, its geography, its politics, culture, everything. However, what I would like you to note is these books, which have, the first book is a 2013 publication. Apart from that, all of these have been published in the last 3 to 4 years. And if you note, they are all by big publication houses, Routledge, Sage, stands for University Press, Cambridge University Press. So these are all transnational mainstream publication houses. Many of the contributors are located in the West. Many of the editors also happen to be located in the West. This is the range, of these books, it covers a huge range. So they are talking about history, they're talking about, as I said, politics, they're talking about culture. Politics, border issues are very significant. Now, what do these non-fiction works do for us? They are supposed to illuminate, the region and the subject which they provide us information. Now, the northeast of India, as we know, is a triangular shape of land which is wedged between 4 different countries. And the most extraordinary fact about this region is that it shares only 4% of its borders with India. The rest of the 96% of its borders is shared with these other countries of Southeast Asia. And therefore, that this very geographical fact points out to the kind of strangeness or the kind of, a marginality that the Northeast faces in the mainstream discourse. So geographically, historically, sociologically, linguistically, we find that its disconnect from India is greater and its proximity to the rest of the Southeast Asian countries is more. So it is a border zone where we can say that, India ends and Southeast Asia begins, and vice versa. Southeast Asia ends and India begins. So it is a vital cultural contact point for a host of, linguistic and cultural communities. And his author's note to a very important book, which I showed you, Strangers No More, New Narratives from India's Northeast. Sanjay Hazarika writes that a very important factor that provoked him to write this book was the kind of short-sighted panditry that was often visible to him. So people would often confuse Manipur with Mizoram, with Meghalaya, and they would have no understanding of the basic issues that these places were going through. And worse is that without ample knowledge, they would find it very easy to jump into debates. So he points out that poor information is the bane of understanding, especially of a complex region like the Northeast. And he finds it very, very unforgivable when this poor level of information is maintained in an era when information is accessible at the click of a hand. So we are, and this is a 2018 publication. So this is Sanjay Hazarika writing his introduction, author's note in 2018, where he talks about the the confusions, the ambiguities in representations that surround the Northeast. And this is inexcusable. To a large section of Indians, the term Northeastern, has come to denote largely a person of Oriental appearance. And Hazarika points out that people are often surprised when they see him, and they will come and say, but you don't look like a Northeastern, as if, there is something, there is a stereotypical Northeastern look. So he says that I have a hard time explaining to people that more than 65 to 70% of the Northeasterns do not actually look, Northeastern. So he points out that information in education would go a long way in dispelling these, these stereotypes that are prevalent about the Northeast and the mainstream Indian imagination. But then how is this information and education going to come about? So he says that apart from a few pages which have been included in the CBSE curriculum since 2000, Northeastern literature, Northeastern writing, information about the Northeast is largely not disseminated in Indian media and education. So at a time like this, when we are unaware, we seem to be largely unaware or misinformed about, a section of our own country, a remarkably culturally empowered and, valuable section of our own country, I believe that non-fiction will have an important role to play. And this is a book which has recently been published by the Sahitya Akademi, which I believe, showcases Northeast India at its best so far. So in the introduction to the book, the editors say that the idea of Northeast, it's just an ideational category. It is more for the sake of convenience, more for the sake of habit. This is a geographical category that is still being used, but in actuality, there is nothing which is called the Northeast or the Northeastern. There is no homogeneous category called the Northeast. It's a vast set of linguistic, systems, of cultural systems, of mythological systems. So this is one crucible of culture that has to be investigated for in and what it is. Now, Niladri Bhattacharya and Joy L.K. Pachau, in their introduction to landscape and belonging in Northeast India, they say that when you view things from the center, then the Northeast appears to be a frontier. It appears to be a periphery of the nation, rather than a cartographical location on the map. And when we try to reorient the gaze, then there can be a possibility of reimagining this space. So how to reorient the gaze, how to, look at the Northeast through the eyes of the locality rather than through the center. So this book, which I am trying to introduce, if you look at the contents of the book, here are the contents before you. It consists of 9 wonderful essays, which are very well arranged, 19 essays, which are very well arranged. They are from all the 8 states. There's one from Arunachal, one from Tripura, there are 2 from Sikkim, 2 from Nagaland, there are 3 essays from Meghalaya, 3 from Mizoram, 3 from Assam, and 4 essays from Manipur. So a total of 19 essays. And I want to point out these particular facts about the book. So the organization is one important element in the book that interested me. In the other books that I had read about the Northeast, the organization was basically done on the point of, from the perspective of theme. So thematical organization. So you had historical essays grouped together, you had political essays grouped together, you had cultural essays grouped together. This is a kind of work which is giving us a flavor of every distinct Northeastern region. So what I love about the book is the organization, the way that it has geographically divided its contents. Coverage is another extraordinary, beautiful, achievement in this book. It covers a wide cross-section. So you have essays relating to politics, you have essays relating to history, you have essays relating to, a lot of essays relating to, the dramatic history, the native dramatic histories of these 8 states. And you can look at the contributors. All of them are well-informed cultural interlocutors to talk about their cultures to the external world. Again, what interests me about this book is its seamlessness. Very seamlessly, these have been organized. These are essays that talk to one another, that refer one another as they move along. Another interesting point that I would like to mention is the language, because what is most intimidating in case of nonfiction is a very, very technical language. So if nonfiction is written with a lot of jargon, it may not be able to fulfill its role of taking information across, to the layman, because that is primarily what we are talking about here. We want the layman to know how things are in the part of the world from which the writer is speaking. So these are essays which have, kind of obviated MLAs, APAs. There is no, academic system of referencing. The language is wonderful, often verging on the lyrical, on the poetic, and it is entirely jargon-free. Also, something remarkable about the language is the way it kind of reinforces the oral traditions of the Northeast. So the way that the language flows, the way it meanders, the way narrative flows is very, very amply illustrative of the oral traditions of the Northeast. And the final point that I wanted to make was its eco-sensibility. There are a number of essays, that seamlessly bring man and environment together. 2 examples that I would like to point out: Mamang Dai's essay, where she talks about, the various cultural communities in Arunachal Pradesh and the initiation rites that the men have. And look at the way that the essay begins. She says, "I'm driving down a road leading to my hometown of Pasighat in East Siang district, Arunachal Pradesh. The weather is cold and clear. Beginning September, it's a good time to travel anywhere on the state. Suddenly, on one side of the road, I see a group of young men standing around a pile of guns stacked up against a big tree. I recognize them as men of the Kiruk, the traditional annual community hunt of the Adi people living in the Siang River Valley. Look how beautiful, Mamang Dai, the first essay in the book begins with a journey. And you realize that the motif of the journey permeates all the 19 essays in the book. It's a kind of journeying from one state to another, from one linguistic distinctiveness to another, from one set of cultural assumptions to another. We have another wonderful essay that I wanted to talk about, Weaving Culture, that talks about the importance of the puan, which is a garment worn in the Mizo community, and how it documents the various types of puans that are there, the various fabrics through which they are made, the various designs, and the important sociological and anthropological purposes that they have been put to since ages and continue to be put to today. So that is one. Again, when I was talking about the eco-sensibility of the book as a whole, these were two essays that caught my attention that, are non-fiction, but you could brand them as perhaps creative non-fiction. So you have Baruch Jacobs' short essay on the Chumlewak, which is about clouds. Both these essays, Zualte Punte's Anatomy of a Big Black Rainstorm on the Mountain and Chumlewak are about storms. They are essays about clouds. And in this particular essay by Baruch Jacob, the cloud is personified. And in the various footnotes to the essay, you can realize that that is the way, in which the Northeastern community, it visualizes a kinship with nature. So the clouds are walking and the things they see, which will also remind you of Kalidasa's Meghdutam. And Anatomy of a Big Rainstorm is again, it talks about the weather and how suddenly, poetically, a rainstorm can come and then again disappear. So coming back, when we are talking about the importance of nonfiction, then Goldsblom says that no matter how much, we may like fiction, we have to keep our feet firmly planted on the ground. So he says that what is most perhaps fallacious about, the things that surround us, the ideas that surround us, is the ideas which are tied to egocentrism and ethnocentrism. So he says that everybody is the center of his or her own world, but then nobody is at the center of the world. So modern astronomers inform us that the entire universe has no center, and it is only when you are in the fog that you believe yourself to be at the center. So perhaps we are all in the fog in that we believe ourselves to be the center, and this fog has to be dispelled, and nothing better than non-fiction to do it, nothing better than non-fiction to dispel this fog of ethnocentrism, of egocentrism. I conclude with 4 more observations about the book, where I believe that these essays can be read as what in James Clifford's terms, we can understand as dialogic ethnography. So dialogic ethnography is a term that Clifford uses, borrowed from Bakhtin. And I believe that these essays are ethnographical accounts, and they proceed in a dialogic continuum. They talk to each other about one another, and that is how they illuminate the source from which they emanate. These are also essays which are written for a transnational readership, the ways, the nuanced ways in which explanations have been provided. It will be accessible and understood by a transnational readership. I also argue for the usability of the book as a text, as a classroom text rather than as a reference book for the library. So we say that a book is usable when there is a transaction of the book between the creator and the user. So this is a book which will be usable in the sense that having read it, students will be able to understand the Northeast in many ways in which they have not visualized it before. And finally, I end with the authority of the book. The book derives its authority from the contributors who are all located in the Northeast. It derives its authority from the editors who have worked for a long period in the Northeast. It also derives its authority from the publication house. Having been endorsed by Sahitya Akademi, I believe that these essays receive the kind of mainstream attention that they may not have received had they been published elsewhere. So with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you so much. And I hope I was audible throughout. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vasudhara Roy. It was a very well-structured presentation. Congratulations for that. And you have very well divided your paper into 2 sections. We'll come back to that and discuss later. I have the pleasure now of inviting Professor Malati Mathur. She's the 3rd presenter in this symposium. And Professor Mathur is Director and Professor of English in the School of Humanities, IGNOU, New Delhi. She holds a PhD in Australian Studies, Australian Literature, and is a poet, a creative writer, a translator, and translates between 3 languages, that is Tamil, Hindi, and English. Malati Mathur was awarded Katha British Council Award for her translations, and she is passionately interested in music and has a degree in sitar as well, which is an extra qualification. Areas of research interest of Malati Mathur include women's writing, in writing in English and translation, of course, which I mentioned here. She has published an anthology volume of poetry that is called Affinities, and then after that, Merging Meridians, Eddie Hope's poetic vision, on which she worked, I understand, for her PhD. And very interestingly, on Ustad Ali Akbar Khan, which is a biography, the Jodhpur Years of that Ustad. She has also 2 translations to her credit, that is Remembering Amma and Reforming. These are the translations of novels which she has done. And I have also spoken of the 3 languages that she works into. The loss of inheritance is what she's going to talk about, and with relation to Rahul Pandita's memoir of a lost home in Kashmir. Talks of the plights of Kashmiri Pandits, their migration, the loss of a homeland, their loss of the inheritance, and their vibrant living identity. These are the issues that she's going to cover. I have the pleasure of inviting my old friend, Professor Malati Mathur, to make her presentation. Please.
Thank you, Professor Rahman, and thank you to the Sahitya Academy for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And I do hope that I'm quite clear and audible.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
When I started, thank you. When I started thinking about what I would talk about, I did think about essays earlier, but then I remembered reading this memoir of Rahul Pandita a couple of years ago, and I also remember how deeply touched I was by this. I should confess that I actually broke into tears at certain points when I read this memoir. It was so heart-wrenching. And then it suddenly struck me that this is something that I could talk about, that I need to talk about. And for those who have not had a chance, I'm sorry, this will be mirrored on the screen, I suppose. It is Our Moon Has Blood Clots, and it is about his lost home in Kashmir. And Rahul Pandita is now based in Delhi, and this book talks about his childhood in Kashmir. He describes the culture, he describes the kind of the way of life that they followed there. He also describes certain festivals and other things that they observed, and how they had to flee their home. And first they were in camps in Jammu, and how they were fleeced by landlords and how they were exploited by people who realized how helpless and vulnerable they were. And then finally the shift to Delhi. So when I was also thinking of how I would title my presentation, of course, the word loss kept occurring again and again and again, which is a very, very obvious characteristic of this entire narrative. But then, when I started thinking of loss, then you also get Kiran Desai's The Inheritance of Loss, again resonating through your mind. And it suddenly struck me that this memoir actually talks about the loss of inheritance. The loss is there. They have inherited that loss. This generation of Kashmiri Pandits has inherited that loss, but it's also the loss of their own inheritance. And when I talk of inheritance, I would like to go past the very tangible and the very materialistic kind of inheritance that one speaks about when we think of this term. And before I actually start talking about it, I am reminded of a line by Professor Satyendra Nandan, who, when he talks about how he had to leave Fiji, and how the Indians who had gone there as bonded labor, as Girmitias, who were then forced to then leave Fiji as well. And he says that one of the greatest joys that a person can feel is to see your grandchildren play in the dust of your childhood. Now, that is one thing that these Kashmiri Pandits have lost. That is one part of their inheritance that they have lost, which is to be there in future as well, just as their forebears had been, just as past generations had been. and that they can no longer see their grandchildren play in the dust of their childhood. And that, I think, is the most poignant loss that one can feel, because one leaves one's home for various reasons. Many times it is voluntary. It is caused by so many factors. But then when someone has to flee their home out of fear for their life, then that is a very, very different kind of loss. And I think that is something that one never, ever forgets, and one cannot really get over during one's lifetime. So the first loss that I'd like to talk about, the loss of inheritance, is of course the most obvious one, the loss of their home. The loss of their ancestral home, their gardens, their orchards, their fields, their possessions, everything that they had to leave behind. And Rahul Pandita also talks about one family where the lady of the house had been keeping her heirloom shawls so safe, which had been passed over through generations, and which she had been keeping so that she could then hand it over to the next generation into their safekeeping. And she just had to leave all that. So that, that was also a part of her heritage. It was a part of the connection that she had to her mother and her grandmother, and which she had hoped that the connection would continue to her daughters and her granddaughters and her daughters-in-law, which, it was completely severed. So these, of course, were the materialistic possessions. But like I said, the materialistic possessions are so deeply bound up with emotion and sentiment that you cannot really say that they are just things, that they are just objects. Because for that lady, those heirloom shawls were not just objects. They were not just shawls which you could wrap around yourself when you felt cold. It was something that when she wrapped around herself, she could feel the arms and the love of her mother and her grandmother. So that is not something that can be objectified or something that can be dismissed lightly as saying, oh, they are just things. And you can always buy more shawls. Of course you can, but you can never buy that same shawl. So these, of course, are the very tangible things that they lost. What about the intangible things? So much of it. Like, for instance, Rahul Pandita talks about all the things that they used to take for granted. And that comes home to them very, very strongly because of one incident at the Jammu camp. And he remembers that they were standing in line for the food to be distributed, which used to come in trucks. And one day they get a lot of tomatoes, and everybody immediately makes a beeline to the truck. And initially they hand out quite a number of tomatoes, but as the line keeps growing and the tomatoes keep diminishing, they start handing out lesser and lesser and lesser, till finally Rahul gets half a tomato, just half, which was supposed to be for the entire family. And when he holds that half tomato in his hand, I mean, a shriveled, a poor specimen of a tomato, he remembers the kind of tomato plants that they had in his home in Kashmir. And he says, I used to use a bat, and I used to just destroy the tomatoes, the unripe tomatoes that were growing on the plants, without a thought that one day, I would be actually looking at half a tomato that would have to suffice for my entire family. So the kind of things that they took for granted, that they never ever thought would end for them, and that it would continue into probably perpetuity. So that is one kind of an intangible loss of an inheritance. And of course, you have all the celebrations, the rituals. Rahul actually talks about Shivratri in quite a bit of a detail, and the kind of rituals that go into the celebration of it, what they used to cook, what is it that they used to bring from the market, how they used to do the puja, what used to happen after the puja, the ceremony, all of that described in great detail, which obviously they could not follow once they had to leave and go into the Jammu camp, because they would not get those kinds of things again. And he also talks about how once the terror had begun, when they were still there in Kashmir, in their home, one Shivratri that they celebrated in complete silence without even blowing the customary conch, because they were so scared to draw attention to themselves. They did not want anyone to know that there was this Kashmiri Pandit family living here still and following their own custom and religion. And so they did it in complete silence. They did not go and buy the customary, the traditional, the fish that used to be cooked for that festival. They did not buy the customary earthenware that they usually bought every year. So all of that was curtailed. It was not considered to be wise or sensible to do something like that. And of course, once they leave their home, they could not do that in the Jammu camps. And he also talks about how in the camp in Jammu, there was this person, this Kashmiri Pandit who dies, and there was no Kashmiri to perform the death rituals. So that I imagine must have been so painful for the family, because if you believe that the soul of the departed person can only be free of this earthly shackles only if they have passed across, helped by certain rituals which one has observed through generations, then for the family it would seem like that because they have not been able to perform those ceremonies and rituals, the soul of their departed one, the loved one, would never be free. So that is something that again they had to live with. So there was also this loss. They inherited the rituals, the observance of festivals, or whether it is a celebration or whether it is a mourning, but those were the kind of things that they had to forego. That maybe forego is not the right word, that they were now deprived of. It was not something that they gave up willingly. It was an involuntary thing. It was something that was forced upon them. Food, so many of our memories are bound up with food, whether it is childhood, because there are so many occasions when if we are not feeling very happy, we tend to cook something that we used to eat in our childhood home, which our mother used to cook for us, and we immediately feel so comforted. So, so much is bound up with food and with food rituals, and you always have these special occasions when certain cuisine is cooked, and it's never cooked at any other time of the year. And I notice in a lot of families that there are people who complain, oh, this tastes so good. Why don't you make it at other times as well? Why do you make it only once a year? So there are so many memories associated with food that, as I just said, the traditional fish for Shivratri, which they could not buy and cook, the incident of the tomatoes. And there's one very, very significant memory that he has connected with food. And that again has to do with after they have shifted to Jammu. And they are in this dirty little room, all of them together. And this is part of a dharmshala, which is also let out for marriages. It is hired out. And one night, somebody comes and knocks at their door. And when his mother opens the door, she is handed a plate with some puris and with some pumpkin curry and one or two other tidbits. And imagine that event had so much of an impact on Rahul that he remembers every little thing that was there on that plate. So it was as though this was some kind of alms given to someone, like you would maybe give to someone, a homeless person on the street. And this person comes and says, we were told that there are refugees staying here, so we have come to give you this food. And when his mother takes that in her hands, that is the time she starts saying, as though it is, it is something as though it has set off some kind of a key inside her, as though she's been wound up. She starts saying, our home in Kashmir had 22 rooms. We are not beggars. We are not homeless. We are not here out of choice. We are not people who have come here begging for alms. We had this wonderful house in Kashmir, which had 22 rooms, and now we are forced to live like this, and where strangers come to give us food. And this becomes one of her litanies. She continues to say this throughout her life. Randomly, she might go and she might be going shopping, she might be standing in a line somewhere, and she will tell the person standing next to her, our home in Kashmir had 22 rooms. So this triggers off this kind of what she sees as something being given to her as alms. It triggers off this kind of a reaction in her, a kind of a trauma that she lives and relives throughout her life. Dress and symbols, that is so much a part of our inheritance too, isn't it? We all dress in certain ways, depending on which community we are from, depending on which part of India we hail from. And the Kashmiri Pandits, of course, have their very special symbols, what we wear in their ears, their bindi, all of that. And when the terror begins in Kashmir, his mother, Rahul's mother, takes off her bindi. She takes off that the traditional jewelry that she wears in her ears, which indicate that she's a married Kashmiri Pandit woman. And this is what they do when they have to leave Kashmir. There are many men who take off the sacred thread and they cut off the tuft of hair, which would immediately mark them to be Kashmiri Pandits. So that is another great loss that they have to put up with. What about memory? Memory is so much a part of what we consider as our inheritance. Memory can be very faulty. It can be very selective. And Rahul Pandita talks about the untrue history that has been spread about why the Kashmiri Pandits had to flee Kashmir. He talks about the politics behind the entire thing. He talks about the governor, Jagmohan, who has been unfairly blamed for this mass migration. And he actually goes into the entire situation behind all of that. And he says what has been presented is untrue history. And what he is trying to do is give you the untrue history versus the reality of memory. So there are these two conflicting zones where people have been fed one kind of narrative, and he is offering the contrary view, which he says is more verifiable, which can be confirmed more easily because it is a part of the history, the part of the lived reality of so many of the Kashmiri Pandits who left. And there is this constant struggle of memory versus forgetting. You try to hold on to what you have left behind. As the years pass, so many of these things get erased in your memory because there are more other incidents, other feelings, other people, other places which come into your consciousness. So willy-nilly, some of these memories are replaced. Some of them get very blurred. Some of them are so dim that you are actually in danger of losing those memories. So there is this constant struggle between holding on to those memories and not allowing them to be forgotten. So it is not only untrue history versus the memories of reality, it is also memories, it is also memory versus forgetting. And his mother, Rahul's mother, after a while starts experiencing, I think it would be a form of dementia, because finally she just stops speaking. She does not say a word. And one day Rahul in a heart-wrenching moment, suddenly realizes that he can no longer remember her voice. He remembers what she used to say. He remembers the words, but he cannot recall her voice saying those words, which can be so terrible for a child. He can see his mother sitting there, completely silent, and try as he may, he is unable to recall the voice. So that is another great loss. That is another, I don't know if you can call it intangible. It's certainly very, very tangible. But isn't that a part of the inheritance that he loses as well? That he's no longer even able to remember what his, how his mother sounded. And when they are leaving Kashmir, they are sitting in this cab, and he sees this group of people who are chanting and saying, "Die, Pandits, die." And it makes the blood run cold within this family, which is sitting in the back of the cab. And then he looks at the driver of the cab, and he is looking straight ahead as though this group of chanters does not exist, as though these chants do not exist. And then he says, as though we in the back of the cab do not exist. So look at how they are completely wiped out in that sense. I mean, what a powerful metaphor it is. Not only the silencing of the mother's voice, but also how the cab driver behaves as though his cab is empty, as though these people are not there to even react to what is being said. And then when he talks about this emptiness to which they have been reduced, as though they have been pushed into a void where nobody can see them or hear them or even know that they exist, he remembers one woman who was part of this mass migration. And he says, I saw her eyes and they were so completely empty. There was nothing in those eyes. And then he says, many, many years later, I saw an image of one of the victims of Auschwitz, from the Holocaust. And he says, the look in that victim's eyes was exactly the look that I had seen in that woman's eyes so many years ago. That emptiness, as though you had gone beyond feeling, as though you had gone beyond experiencing anything, and you were just so completely resigned to what is happening or what is going to happen that you no longer care what has gone before, and you no longer care what is going to come in the future. I have, of course, not really talked about all the violence, the killings, the selective killings, the rapes, which again is an attempt to erase not only identities, but also their own sense of self. When you kill someone or you rape a woman, you are inflicting the kind of violence upon her which you think will erase her sense of self and identity. It has nothing to do with a sexual desire, but everything to do with power, everything to do with domination. So that is something that is common in this, the narratives of all these people who have to flee. And Rahul's uncle, who talks to him, who he was very close to, tells him how when we achieved freedom in 1947, he had to move from Pakistan. And at that point of time, his uncle was a refugee of the state. And in 1990, he is displaced once more. He becomes a refugee once more. And this time, he is a refugee in his own country. However, after this list of losses, which Rahul Pandita does not speak about, he just describes what happens. He just describes the kind of experiences that they go through, beginning with the idyllic existence that they had in their home, moving on to the terror that they felt, the fear which forced them to flee, the kind of squalid life that they had in the Jammu camps, and then the kind of heat and dust of Delhi, which made them feel ill. Throughout all that, it is just a description. He is not listing the losses. I am the one who's doing it. Because through that narrative, one can see what this family, and through this family, who are representative of that entire community which was forced to flee, what it is that they have lost. They have lost an entire way of life. They have lost their culture. They are losing their songs. They are losing their festivals, their folk tales. You know, all the songs that one sings at weddings. They are losing all of that. So it's an entire way of life. It's a culture. It's almost as if it's an erasure of a community. But there is one thing that really stood out for me, which is that he talks about when he was invited to be a part of a panel to speak on Kashmiri Pandits and what is happening in the valley. And he does go back once, you see. He goes back to see his childhood home. And a lot of people there are frightened. They are scared that he has come back to claim his inheritance. But he has no wish to do that. He just wants to see his childhood home. He just wants to go inside and see what has remained and what has changed, and just feel that, and just relive those moments that he had in his childhood. And when he's on this panel, he says there was this very rabid colonel or somebody who talks about revenge and all kinds of violence. And Rahul stands his ground and he tells him, I have lost my home, not my humanity, which is such a huge takeaway. When I'm talking about all that he's lost in his inheritance, humanity is so much a part of one's inheritance. And if he has not lost that, what can one say about the generosity of his spirit? So that is something that he has retained. Amidst all the losses, he has retained his humanity. And that was something that touched me to the core. That's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Professor Malati Mathur. There are many narratives behind the narrative that you were trying to explore for us. Thank you very much for this presentation. We'll come back to it later. There is a slight change in the order of presentations here. Professor Shymati Mukherjee is not keeping quite well today, so she would like to make a presentation before her turn. I would like to invite her now and say a word about her and her work before she does. Professor Shymati Mukherjee is from Presidency University, Calcutta. She teaches there in the Department of Performing Arts, the Presidency University, and apart from that, being an academic, she's also a singer and a documentary maker, which is an added advantage and an added quality to her qualifications. Professor Mukherjee has been a Fulbright Fellow at San Diego in USA and published most recently the many dialogues of Sri Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita and published on the theory and practice of performing arts in ancient India, which of course is a very important and a very difficult topic to work on now, especially when you go back to ancient India and think of the performing arts then. She has worked on that. She is translator of Alok Ranjan Das's Tagore and articles. She has several articles written, published articles on Toni Morrison, Maxine Kingston, and Simone Schwartz, Mahashweta Devi, Ruqayya Shekhawat Hussain, and of course Mandu. She's going to talk of gender and travelogue and feminism in the 19th century. This is a very interesting text that she has chosen to talk about today. And this is about a Bengali woman's England, how she looks at it and how this narrative becomes part travel and part sociological and political analysis of democracy. She also thinks of the impacts of colonialism and cultural, say, servitude observations from the cultural sidelines, as you can say, the impact of colonialism and the experience of living in England and looking at it from close and from the farthest quarters possible. also thinks of role of women and the broader predicament of the class and the gender. So many issues are coming up here. So she tries to interrogate the colonial angle, the colonialist angle, the patriarchy and the power politics, etc. Before I think I shouldn't be taking more time introducing this. I would invite Professor Shymati Mukherjee to make a presentation with reference to what I have said now. Thank you. Please come ahead. Professor Shymati Mukherjee.
Can you hear
Yes.
me?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Now.
Okay, my voice is all broken. You can, it's from coughing constantly for the last 3 days, but I hope you can still hear me, hear the words that I'm going to speak. Thank you for having me here, Sahitya Akademi, Shanjuktadi, Professor Rahman, the chair, Mr. Jyoti Krishna Varma, who's so efficiently organized all the entire web talk event for today, and my very distinguished panelists. I have stuck to Mr. Varma's stipulation that we keep to 10 to 12 minutes. So even till this morning, I was paring away at my paper to come to 16 minutes. So then I think I brought it down to 12 minutes, but I guess that's okay. All right. So as long as my voice carries, I'm really worried about that. If my voice does not create a problem.
That's fine. Please go ahead.
Okay, right. So I'm going to speak today on Krishna Bhabini. Krishna Bhabini, women had such long names in the 19th century. Imagine a woman having a name called Krishna Bhabini today, or Koilash Bashini. I'm, stunned by the long names women had in those days. Anyway, so my paper is entitled Krishna Bhabini Das and Das is Englande Bongo Mohila. That translates into a Bengali woman in England. This book has been recently translated by Anita Singh, published by Hawakol. However, I'm using the Bengali version, and all translations that I use in my paper are my own. Okay, so in her groundbreaking 1993 book, Woman Native Other, Trinity Minha mounts a strong feminist critique of Eurocentric and scripted models of writing and posits that each writer must be positioned within the intersecting fields of race, class, gender, and historical context. I have always found this a very convenient theoretical paradigm for critical analysis, especially of texts written by women, and I intend to use it for locating and analyzing the text under consideration in this paper. As much as race and gender are explosive contexts for Krishna Bhabini Das, the historical context is a particularly charged one. Race is obviously, this is 19th century. Her book was published in 1885, and she was in England from 1882 to 1890. So subject race, decolonized others, subject race, class, Hindu, middle class, Bhadralok. This is a term that emerges later, the Bhadralok community, entirely an urban community. So class, middle class, Hindu, Bhadralok, race, subject race, gender, a woman who broke two frontiers to reach England. One was the Andur Mohol or Zenana of her own house, and the other was the crossing of the Kalapani of her own nation. Now, to do a little bit of historical recapitulation, Ghulam Murshid, Bharati Ray, Geraldine Forbes, historians and cultural critics, have written extensively about how exposure to Western ideals of granting women egalitarian status influenced prominent male thinkers of the 19th century, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Dwarkanath Ganguly. Dwarkanath Ganguly, incidentally, was the husband of the first doctor, woman doctor, Kadumbini Ganguly. Initially Kadumbini Basu and then Kadumbini Ganguly. So Dwarkanath Ganguly, Akshaya Kumar Datta, Pyari Chand Mitra, and others. To create a climate of change through writing and urging legislation for the greater empowerment of women. Raja Ram Mohan Roy's Tracts Against Sati. His second tract against Sati was published in 1819. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy's Tracts Against Sati led to the abolition of Sati Act in 1829. Vidyasagar campaigned for widow remarriage, and the Hindu Widow Remarriage Act was passed in 1856. Now, it is ironic that Krishna Bhavini Das's father-in-law, Srinath Das, was a friend of Vidyasagar, who supported him in principle, yet in practice, Srinath Das excommunicated his older son when the latter married a widow. So anyway, between our practice and our professions falls the shadow, as is often the case. He also excommunicated his younger son, Krishna Bhavini's husband, for living too long in England. And when Krishna Bhavini left for England with her husband in 1882, Srinath Das did not allow their only child, Tilottama, then aged 5, to accompany them. This early severing of the parent-child relationship was to have extremely tragic repercussions later. Tilottama dies. She dies when she was about 20 years old. To pass now to the moment of epic transformation, when epistemological categories regarding the sign woman altered irrevocably in the 19th century, I would like to draw attention to Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's 1985 essay, Subaltern Studies, Deconstructing Historiography, where she posits that the subaltern sign brings about, quote, a functional change in sign systems, end quote. It is my contention in this paper that woman or female as a new sign similarly disrupts the syntax of 19th century Bengali culture, reversing, you can also Indian, we can extend Bengali into Indian, reversing and realigning conventional notions and expectations of women's agency and power. A tradition of women writers was initiated who began their work from the mid-19th century and paved the way for the emergence of woman as a radical sign within the cultural economy of Bengal and India. Their endeavors altered irrevocably the notions of the term feminine held previously and led to the dramatic gendering of history and culture. The inaugural moment of this outstanding efflorescence of women's writing in polemics, travel writing, autobiography, and journal articles could be said to begin with Kailash Bhashini Devi's Hindu Mohila Gane Hina Bosta, which means the degraded state of Hindu women, which was published in 1863. Other writers like Rashasundari Devi, Bibi Teheran Nisa, Sharna Kumari Devi, Man Kumari Devi, and bringing up this entire train finally in the early beginning years of the 20th century was Begum Ruqya Sakawat Hussain. In Inglande Bongo Mohila, Krishna Bhamini Das is able to claim her voice with such distinction that she not only emerges as the narrator of her own life, although in a very veiled manner, but also that of the nation. The autonomy of her position as narrator-writer was validated not only by her own voice, narrating her experiences, but doing it in her own language. I see this moment in history when women claim their voices in such a resonant manner and romantic, enacting the romance of letters, texts, and learning. Inglande Bongo Mohila, a Bengali woman in England, opens up multiple fields of comparative analysis vis-a-vis gender, patriarchy, culture, writing, sociological and polemical writing, and travel. It was an age of empiricism and historicism, when travel was looked upon as an epistemological drive to expand the frontiers of knowledge and aid in discourse formation. As we have all learned from Saib in Orientalism, that the discourse of the Orient was created by the travel writings of European travelers to the Middle East, and Niccolò Conti, or Conti, I don't know how to pronounce that accurately, came to India in early 15th century, and his writings were also helped to create this discourse of the Orient. So travel writing, Krishnabhamini Das in that way is really engaged in, and she did it very consciously, perhaps somewhat, engaged in this question of discourse formation at that time. Now, regarding, since I mentioned the question of comparative frameworks offered by Inglande Bongo Mohila, other texts written about England by male writers who had also traveled to England were Ramesh Chandra Datta's 3 Years in Europe, Keshav Chandra Sen's Diary in England, Shivnath Shastri's Englanded Diary, and Rabindranath's Europe Prabashit Patra. Then there were certain women, Toru Datta, Rajkumari Bandyopadhyay, Gyananandini Devi. They had all traveled to England before Krishnabhamini. But we have to remember, Toru Datta was Christian, Gyananandini Devi was Brahmo, and so Christians and Brahmos were definitely far more progressive than Hindus, whereas Krishnabhamini was Hindu. And but none of the other women engaged in writing about England in the systematic and exhaustive manner in which Krishnabhamini does. So her significance is really quite unquestionable and fairly spectacular for her times. And on a personal note, your personal meaning, it doesn't, it's not part of the theoretical analysis, but that she paid a very heavy price for it in ending up losing her daughter. So surely that was a very high price to pay for all the other accomplishments she managed to obtain. So, and then there are comparisons also with writing by British women travelers to India. 2 examples are Eliza Fay's Original Letters from India, published in Calcutta in 1817, and Fanny Parks's Wandering of a Pilgrim, published in England in 1850. Krishnabhamini Das's Inglande Bongo Mohila does not have a marked autobiographical eye, who is assertive, experiencing, emphatic, in the manner as in Elizabeth Fay. She allows very little access to her personality, keeping her tone detached, impersonal, and scientific. Both in England and in India, the shift regarding the sign woman in the 19th century cannot be ignored. Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, first raised the clarion call for greater rights amongst women. For all the vilifying that she underwent, a process of change, reinforced by other women like Catherine Macaulay, Mary Astle, Mary Ann Radcliffe, Mary Hayes, Anna Barbauld, and Hannah More, eventually led to women winning the vote in 1928 in England. So Krishnabhamini lived in England during a time when a great shift regarding women's agencies, abilities, voices, and writing was taking place. She notes with happiness and admiration, quote, "At one point, I too, like many others, thought of English women as lazy. However, Having observed them from close quarters, I see that my suppositions were entirely wrong. Like men, they retain the ability to labor hard, endure hardship, and demonstrate noteworthy competence. Thus, instead of emulating them superficially, if one emulates these admirable qualities that they have, then much good would come of it. Ruefully, her attention turns to the lot of Bengali Hindu women. Quote, Hindu women also had spirit and determination at one point, and they still do. However, in the absence of education and freedom, we are not able to demonstrate such qualities. She goes on, the indifference and disregard of men and numerous superstitions are responsible for the degraded state of women. There is no reason to think that the existence of strong character traits diminishes women in any respect. In a poem that she writes much later, she throws out this question, oh, those who call yourselves men, why have you made India such a cruel place? This is not in this text, of course. So, Krishna Bhamini begins her analysis of English society and its mores by declaring, quote, if we compare our lives with those who have freedom and independence, we will realize how impoverished our lives are. The idea of freedom and education determining the health of nations are the central themes that run through England Bongo Mohila. Although the searing critique she makes of English greed and imperialistic ambition half implicates the notion of freedom in ruthless self-aggrandizement. Quote, the English are an entirely selfish nation. They look into the issue of self-gain at all times. Although they are wealthier than any other nations, they are still not satisfied. They wish to swallow everything. It is to satisfy this intense greed that they have established themselves all over the world. There is no nation on earth from where they have not looted its wealth. Yet they suffer no compunction from that. End quote. She also points to the English habit towards extreme intake of alcohol and spending, elaborate spending. Regarding alcohol, she describes how this induced bestial behavior in both men and women of the lower strata of society. She, however, praises the English habit for industry, hard work, and competence. She posits that no matter how mean the profession, an English worker is characterized by efficiency and competence. She unreservedly praises the democratic strengths of English society, the power of the parliament, and the free press. She seems rather nostalgic when she describes the many schools that England possessed, and that education was something that was accessible to people from all strata of society. She also speaks about Queen Victoria as an ideal monarch, to whom paradoxically she says Indians needed to express loyalty. Although she keeps her tone objective, yet one can assess the person behind the objective tone when she speaks of English racism and denigration of other people. Quite astutely, she writes that although one could easily be fooled by the politeness of shop owners, they actually made fun of those from other countries who could not speak English well. I'm almost at the end of my paper. In the chapter, Women and the Nation, of his Fragments of a Nation, Partha Chatterjee posits that in the 19th century, men wrote what was Atmachurit meaning autobiography, and that writing this autobiography required methodological rigor, structuring, planning, detailing. And this kind of an intellectually demanding task was beyond the capacities of women. And so what women wrote at that time was Smriti Kotha. Like Rashundari Devi's Amar Jibon is partly Smriti Kotha. Smriti Kotha means reminiscences, because reminiscences are allowed to be meandering and do not require the kind of regimentation of material that Akachuri requires. But I would really argue with Partha Chatterjee's surmise vis-a-vis the case of Krishna Bhamini. Because in Krishna Bhamini Das, we have established that the 19th century, starting from the neoclassical age, it was an age where scientific methodologies, empiricism, documentation, these were the hallmarks, you could say, or these were the reigning principles in. I do not want to say that they were the reigning principles in intellectual life, because people were doing philosophy and they were doing arts and they were doing music. But we cannot deny that empiricism, historicism, documentation were very strong impulses in the 19th century in Europe. And these were impulses that the British brought to India. So in Krishna Bhamini Das, what one gets is the classic Cartesian subject, proudly claiming the power of the human mind to assess, observe, understand, categorize, structure, plan, and create a progressive linear narrative. Coming now to the end of my paper, I think it's gone pretty fast. Well,
we have to keep track of time, please.
Have I gone over my time?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had no idea. I'll stop right now. So Tilottama writes a poem in which she says that my mother, you were my mother, but you left me behind. And you did not think of me. So this poem was published with Krishna Bhamini Das's England. She published it with her book. So there's a dialogic interface right there, which remains quite unresolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee. One feels really sad that one has worked on something and doesn't have enough time to talk about. But I understand that symposia and conferences and seminars are all about exploring our ideas together so that we can work further and publish it at a larger scale. So thanks for your presentation. We'll talk about it and come back later to it. So, friends, we have 45 minutes left with us and there are 3 speakers now. So I would request you once again to please keep track of time so that we are in a position to listen to each one carefully and also to be able to, at the end, conclude things so that we can go back home with something in hand. I have the pleasure of inviting Nishikolo, Dr. Nishikolo, who is Associate Professor of English at Brahmananda Keshav Chandra College in Kolkata. And she's also a guest faculty at the Department of Comparative Literature at Calcutta University. Dr. Pulagurtha has worked on Coleridge, which we don't work these days. We have forgotten all about except for the classroom. I'm very happy to learn this. And she did her PhD on that as a research fellow, as a UGC research fellow, to say so, and completed 3 UGC research projects after that. She was awarded Associateship of Indian Institute of Advanced Studies in Shimla. And her area of his interest include, of course, naturally, British Romantic Literature, Indian writing in English, diaspora, and British Romantic Literature. And Shakespeare adaptations in films, diaspora studies included. So she has published in prestigious publications and very interesting ones, the Coleridge Bulletin, the Encyclopedia of Post-Colonial Studies, and Shakespeare in Indian cinemas, and Cambridge Companion to British and Romantic Religion. She has the monograph on Derozio, our first very, very important poet. I often say that our first poet was a major poet. Derozio was a major poet and the first poet, so to say, and she has a monograph on that. Collection of travel essays out in the open. She has got and edited a volume on trends across and borders and travels and poems put together in the real and the unreal and the other poems. She's going to talk about travel writing and writing travel, inversing and then trying to present a case. We'll discuss the genre of travel writing with reference to Is That Even a Country, Sir? Journeys in North India by Train, Bus and Tractor. Very interesting title and must be a very adventurous kind of thing that she's going to talk about. It was originally published in Hindi and 2012 and later translated, which was published in 2017. She's going to talk about that. Translated by Anurag Asnet. Dr. Nishikolo, you are most welcome to make your presentation, but once again, an odd reminder that please keep track of time. I'm very sorry saying so, but one has to, because one has to keep track of time so that we can come back and collectively discuss a few points later. Thank you. Dr. Polagurtha.
Thank you so much, Professor Rahman. I will try to stick to the time. Hopefully, is my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
It's okay. Yes.
Yes. So I'm going to talk in brief about travel writing and writing travel, and I'll come to the text which you referred to. So without much ado, I would like to go into talking about what I'm going to about travel writing. Travel is about negotiating the known and the unknown, the familiar and the unfamiliar. It brings in ideas of negotiation, urban planning, history, architecture, space, food, memory, exile, emigration, and colonialism. As a free, voluntary, spontaneous movement, travel could be contrasted to ideas of displacement. This brings into contention as to who can and who cannot travel, an important idea in today's world where violence has caused forced displacement of people. There are places where one cannot travel to because of restriction, and this counters the basic idea of travel as a free, spontaneous movement. There is also the travel of certain people that is necessitated by work, for instance, journalists traveling to war-ravaged zones. Travel writing has been an important but an underrated literary genre. For a very long time, it has been outside the purview of literary and critical discussion. The popularity of this genre has increased in the 20th century as tourism became one of the largest industries in the world. As mobility, travel, cultural connections became easier and much more common, the interest in reading about travel has increased as well. Travel writing works with the way things are and then presents and represents the perspectives, the values, and the belief systems of the writer are of importance in this. The idea that travel literature is a genre which reflects the social conditions of the world in these times of cross-cultural contact has often resulted in the reissuing of many books, the interest in many books and magazines which have been written on travel, books of the past as well. And I'm so glad that Shymati spoke about one such text, which, and there has been a lot of discussion on this work, and there have been myriad of translations. She did refer to one. The genre has been of great help in prominent areas of research like post-colonial studies and feminism, which has once again increased the academic interest in the genre as well. Travel writing and writing on travel brings up various issues and themes. What makes people travel? And these are certain questions that I thought would, are important when we are considering travel writing. How does the idea of travel writing work to present one's lived space? How do the familiar and well-known take on a charm so very different? How do people and places seem to interact to create a sense of lived experience? What role do memory and nostalgia play in travel? Does writing about travel bring about a reliving of the whole experience? Questions of how do bad experiences while traveling color one's experience, one's writing of the place visited? Also, who travels? For what purpose? And how does the purpose or nature of travel determine itineraries? What is the role of travel writing in colonialism? Do images, narratives, descriptions produced by travelers influence or work to present constructions of identity? How does travel writing work to present the little known or almost forgotten places and people? at a time when more and more women are beginning to travel either alone or in women-only groups for pleasure, how do their experiences of travel add to the genre of travel narratives? Could travel writing be gendered? These are some of the points which I thought were interested when we look at this particular genre. Apart from well-known books in the genre by writers like Vikram Seth and Amitav Ghosh in India, and lots and lots of other people writing in the West, there are many Indian writers who began to experiment with the genre with books like Chitrita Banerjee's Eating India, Saman Subramaniam's Following Fish, Srinath Perur's If It's Monday, It Must Be Madurai. There have been recent tales of travel bloggers like the Heat and Dust Project, The Shooting Star. Another book that I would like to refer to is Rajat Ubhaykar's Truck Day India, A Hitchhiker's Guide to Hindustan, which chronicles his journey across India, hitchhiking on trucks for over 10,000 kilometers. I would also like to refer to Sudha Mahalingam, who is the author of The Gods Must Be Crazy. She's one of those women travelers who, over the last 4 decades, she's an economist by training, and she has leveraged almost conference invites to travel to little-known destinations in over 65 countries. Of course, the book that I would concentrate upon is the one that Professor referred to. This is the book. The Hindi one is the original one, and this is the English translation of that. What interested me about this book, which I've been reading recently, stuck at home, and travel seems to be a very remote kind of a thing in these times. This book weaves memoir with history, myth, political commentary, rumor, and human interest stories. Originally published in Hindi in 2012, written by Anil Yadav, it was translated by Anurag Basnath in 2017. And this presents travels of Anil Yadav to the Northeast. A journalist traveling. Rich in insights gleaned from the author's conversations with chief ministers, surrendered militants, an AIDS-afflicted unwed mother, and a politically astute boatman, among others, it is both an expose on the consequences of corruption involving political leaders, guardians of law and underground, and other insurgent outfits, and at the same time offers a kaleidoscope of experiences, opening many windows to a resource-rich region, often, dismissed as an all-round mess. It's kind of located away. And he speaks wonderfully about it when he talks about the meeting with people, his memories of places and people. So the travel undertaken by Anil Yadav and fellow journalist Anhesh Shashwat in November 2000 to the Northeast is the basis of this book. Unemployed and desperate to make a mark, they hoped, especially in the wake of the massacre in Assam of Hindi-speaking migrants from North India, to send exclusive dispatches on militancy from a land of unceasing terror. So here we have people traveling for the purposes of, writing for the newspaper, a journalistic kind of an approach to it. Short on cash and ill-informed about ground realities, both these journalists faced quite a lot of problems, things which they had not bargained for. Anhesh Shashwat could not complete the journey. He had to head back. He was forced to quit midway because of various issues. But Anil Yadav continued on this journey, and that is what forms the basis of this book. This is what he writes. And I begin this quotation because it kind of resonates with what many of us do when we first go to a place which we have maybe heard of or have little information about. And this is from the text. From the pictures in the social science and geography textbooks of my childhood, I knew there were tea gardens in the Northeast where women plucked flowers from bushes. Once upon a time, the women there used to turn outsiders into sheep through magic and keep them as pets. Also, that there was some place called Cherrapunji where it rained the most in the world. But they begin in this way, but as you go along, you understand that drawn into this world. Anil Yadav is drawn into the world, and he speaks with a wonderful sense of empathy for the place and for the people. He speaks about the realities of the places that he visits, which are shocking at times. He writes about prominent Naga militants hiding in the jungles of Myanmar and Bangladesh, and funded by the ISI and other agents who have reportedly, there is some kind of a surveillance policy going on. Some of these people have brokered a kind of a secret deal with the powers to be. The book talks about how in Manipur's Churachandrapur, India's drug and alcohol-infested AIDS capital, the local detox methods are apparently so humanizing that addicts and human rights organization takes protest marches around them. And you understand that as he goes more and more into delving into this place, finding out more and more about the place, he begins to identify himself with the people, their struggles, and begins to see these in a different perspective. He writes, every militant organization wants to maintain its hold on Moreh because Moreh is one of the largest centers for the cross-border smuggling of drugs and other contraband. When the NSCN, which is the Nationalist Social Council of Nagaland, clashes with Kuki militants over tax collection in Moreh, Naga-Kuki clashes break out in Manipur, Nagaland, and North Kachar. Women and children are butchered, villages are torched, and ideologies on both sides start spinning political and sociological theories about the massacres. In spite of the grim portraits of entire communities living in the shadow of state neglect and death from substance abuse, encounters, insurgent executions, there is a wonderful sense of warmth and humor underlying Yadav's interactions with the local people. And I'll just refer to one such interaction. This is what he writes. We were to meet the king of Cherrapunji, Freeman Singh Siam. He was astride a bike wearing sunglasses and on his way to scout new sources of drinking water in the neighborhood. He was happy that the maximum amount of rain in the world falls upon the land of which he was king, and anxious about where to sell the bumper crop of 27 different varieties of oranges which had been harvested that year. The book is filled with vignettes, anecdotes, and cameos. Like that about the Manipuri Yadav meets in Moirang, who wrote letters to his beloved in blood and ensured a steady supply by attaching a leech to his flesh. There is also a grim portrait that is seen in his empathy for beleaguered outsiders who are living in fear, alienated by cultural differences and a history of distrust. And I found those places where he talks about the familiar, which he is now understanding in a much more better way. For instance, he writes, and I'm quoting from the text, where he's talking about Cherrapunji. And all of us have grown up knowing that that's a place that receives the highest amount of water, rain. And this is what he says. The tribals of Sohra have a name for torrential rain, Slaup. If torrential rain falls for 9 days and 9 nights, it is called Danio Miyat. If for 14 days and 14 nights, thick ropes of water tie heaven and earth, it is called Khadsa Miyat. This is the image of Cherrapunji that most of us have. But then in the book, we are told of something else. We are told that a new word has come into the local vocabulary of the people here. And this new word is drought. So the reality is hence vastly different. And Anil Yadav writes, a visitor to Cherrapunji in the winter months, especially he who goes there with a pitter-patter impression of the place, receives a stiff jolt of surprise when he enters this hilly region, which receives an annual rainfall in the range of 10,000 to 12,000 millimeters. He will find small wheeled trolleys crawling on the road bearing empty canisters and drums. People range far and wide to fetch water and keep their households from becoming parched. Things are a bit, before the pandemic came in, things were a bit different because the Northeast has been a place where lots and lots of people had been going for the purposes of tourism. So things have changed from the time that he had written. And what comes out clearly in this book is an immense amount of empathy for the subjects that he's writing about, the engagement with the Naga impulse for freedom, and the depiction of the incongruity of modern day borders that divide people straddling both sides of the border. He does speak about the alienation, the Northeast alienation and the violence, which is often a result of insecurities born out of a belief that there are limited resources and many claimants to them. While personal experiences form a major part of travel writing, critics such as Mary Campbell and Stephen Greenblatt, among others, note an element of wonder as a recurring theme and trope in travel writing. Since the 18th century, travel writing is engaged more with life writing, in travel diaries, journals, travel memoirs, and in recent times as travel blogs. Travel writing works in bringing in memory as the writer relives and recalls not just the journey, but the experience, sometimes in new ways. It allows for an episodic recalling rather than one that always strictly adheres to chronology, as various aspects of life weave and work to recreate the experience. Travel writing also has links to cultural and historical memory in that it works to bring forth new and hitherto unknown or lesser known places, monuments, and buildings into the public domain. As we deal with COVID-19, travel seems to be a distant dream. The tourism sector has, of course, been badly hit. It is to be seen how this affects, I'm almost done. It is to be seen how this affects travel writing in the days to come. Because travel is not just about places, it is about people. And in a world where social distancing has become so very imperative, it is interesting to see how this will affect travel and travel writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishi. Excuse me for...
Now I understand.
Yes, thank you for your appreciation. Friends, we come to the last two presentations here, and I do not really know how to introduce and how to invite an old friend of more than 2 decades, maybe 3. About 2 decades and more, he introduced me to Usmania. And when Shymati Mukherjee, our common friend, was there, we miss her so greatly, and she was the link between me and Professor Sachidanand Mohanty. Sachidanand Mohanty has been an old friend, great academic all these years, has been working extensively in areas that I will refer to right now. He's formerly a professor and head department of English at the University of Hyderabad, and formerly a vice chancellor of the Central University of Odisha. When I was looking at his bio, he mentions his vice chancellorship at the end. I was really happy about that, because generally people put their vice chancellor, give premium to their vice chancellorship than to their professorships. I'm really happy, Sachi, for doing this, that you took and you put premium in your professorship than your vice chancellorship, which was a short-lived experience. A winner of many awards from Katha, from British Council, from Fulbright, Charles Wallace, and lots of other scholarships. Published extensively on British literature, American literature, post-colonial literature, gender and translation studies. These are the areas that he has worked on all these years. Has published from Oxford, from Sage, from Routledge, and from Orient Black Swan. I'm just cutting it short because it's time that we have to call him and not spend time in this. But he's going to talk about a very foundational text, I would say, because this is a text which he has discovered, which was published about 70 years ago, and a text of great worth. It is a 2-volume autobiography by Irish Indian writers, James and Margaret, and it was published in India about 70 years ago. Not paid attention yet. It is goes to the credit of Mohanty that he has been able to lay his hands on this, and it's going to talk about that. It has really, I would call it a foundational text, especially when we talk of the non-fiction prose with reference to that, I would say. There are many references to Annie Besant, to Tagore, to Gandhi, and to Sri Aurobindo, and other implications are there. But I should stop here and ask him, Professor Mohanty, to please take on and tell us about the work that you have done and would like to share with us.
Thank you very much, Professor Anisur Rahman. Anis to many of us. And thank you for invoking the presence of Professor Shymati Mukherjee, to us. And talking about somebody who has been missing, a missing link, as it were. The term missing link has a somewhat derogatory kind of a pejorative connotation. But I think in my context, in our context, I'm going to talk about the missing link in a very, very positive sense. I would like to take you back to the old debate about the ethics of Indians writing in English, whether Indians ought to or should write in English. And I think in that context, we remember David McCutcheon, who had said, and jokingly, that Indian writing in English is like a dog walking on its hind legs. And also the question was whether it is the question of sensibility, whether it is a question of hibiscus versus daffodils. When we talk about the tradition, the literary tradition of Indian writing in English, I think we normally talk about Toru Dutt, Sarojini Naidu, Sri Aurobindo, and then we take a leap to the modern Indian English poets like Nissim Ezekiel, R. Parthasarathy, Jayanta Mahapatra, and the others. Today, I would like to test some of my hypotheses, and I would like to test some new ideas. And I would like to suggest here, and it's the first time I'm doing this, I'd like to suggest that the missing link that we have in mind, I have in mind, is James and Margaret Cousins. Indeed, the autobiography that I'm going to talk about and the other works, Renaissance in India and New Ways in English Literature, were seminal to understanding and creating the kind of a canon that he had in mind. And at the last part of my talk here, I shall try to give some reasons as to why, for example, that particular canon was really not acceptable, and why a different kind of a canon was became legitimate, and then this is the canon that we accept today. So, Reclaiming Lost Memories, We Two Together by James and Margaret Cousins. I think I don't need to really labor the point as to why diaries, memoirs, etc. have become so central to memory studies today. And I'm going to reclaim one of the important kind of autobiography that has been referred to, We Two Together. The first part of my talk here will comprise some information, and I would like to really bring in some information because that is not generally available in the public domain. And the second and the third will be the area where I'm going to theorize certain kind of propositions and then finally arriving at some conclusion. Now, the work We Two Together, it chronicles the life and work of James and Margaret Cousins. Margaret Cousins was a feminist, women suffragette member, and she had been present in England, in Ireland, as well as in India. And they were, both James and Margaret were friends of W.B. Yeats and A.E., namely George Russell. He wrote plays, poems, and non-fictional prose dealing with the Celtic vision. James Margaret Cousins was an active member of the Dublin Abbey Theatre and acted and produced plays. He and Margaret were drawn to social and political causes like women's suffragette movement, national liberation movement in India and Ireland. They made their home at Adyar, Madras, now Chennai, and Madanapalli in the Chittoor district of the present-day Andhra Pradesh as educationist, writer, and art historian. James Cousins had literary interaction with some of the finest minds of the time, as Anita said, with Tagore, Gandhi, and Sri Aurobindo. Spent a year in Keio University in Japan as a visiting professor, and they were, both James and Margaret were influential members of the Pan-Asian movement, which was very important at that time, and which has just receded into the background. Today we talk about SAARC, we talk about ASEAN, but we don't talk about the Pan-Asian movement, which was a very, very important development in the first decades of the 20th century. And I think if you look at the debates which took place between Tagore and Okakura, and the rise of Japan as a kind of a military force, for example, and that project, for example, became a back burner. And unfortunately, today, for example, we do not really talk about the Pan-Asian movement. I'm suggesting that James Cousins' Eastern journey was a part of that kind of exploration in order to discover the Pan-Asian unity. Cousins' advocacy of the new art form based on Indian spirituality may be treated today in today's context of political correctness as essentialist. But I think it is important to bear in mind that although he was talking about the importance of Indian mysticism and the Indic traditions and spirituality, he did not have a kind of a hegemonic, domineering kind of a approach in mind. And he in fact he had a very, very liberal and heterogeneous approach to defining the Indian literary sensibility and the canon. He was a cultural traveler who championed modernity of the alternative kind. I think what is it that I had in mind when I talk about the modernity of the alternative kind? If you talk about the Enlightenment principle, I'm skipping many things for lack of time. I think there are 4 defining characteristics of modernity as it has been understood in the Western context. One is rationality, second is individuality, third is universality, and the fourth is progress. So if you talk about modern, you need to have a primacy in individuality and rationality. Now, I think those who talk about alternative modernities, and I have been also talking about that along with others, I'm suggesting that the opposite, the contrary to rationality is not irrationality, is non-rationality, for example, / spirituality or mysticism, for example. And similarly, universality doesn't mean the primacy of the West. And progress is not necessarily a monopoly of the West itself. And progress and civilization does not proceed in a linear kind of a fashion. So of late, both postmodernism and other approaches, epistemologies have really theorized and explored. Although postmodernism seems to be a free-for-all kind of a thing, I would like to suggest that the alternative modernity that James Cousins and Margaret Cousins and Sri Aurobindo and Tagore had talked about, it was not a free-for-all. It definitely had a kind of an organized approach to understanding life, literature, and our own worldview. At Adyar, Cousins served as a sub-editor in Annie Besant's journal, The New India. And his interest in Indian art brought him closer to the Bengal School of Art, Rabindranath Tagore, O.C. Ganguly, John Woodruff, and others. He taught what Sri Aurobindo called the national value of art. I think it's very striking that at least 2 or 3 of the books that James Cousins wrote and published as Renaissance in India, for example, that is precisely the kind of a title of a book by Sri Aurobindo. And if you look at the correspondence that Cousins had with Tagore and the correspondence that he had with Sri Aurobindo, this trinity, I think it's a remarkable kind of a trinity. And I think we have not understood adequately the literary interaction among the 3, Tagore, Sri Aurobindo, and Cousins, which is very central to the kind of exploration that I have in mind. Cousins was invited by the government of Travancore as the art advisor, a post he held till 1947. He established the first Indian art gallery at Sri Chaitanya Chitralayam in September 1938. He served the Academy of Arts at Kalakshetra as the vice president with Rukmini Devi Arundel as the director. He saw the continued relevance of the Irish experience for India in political, cultural, and spiritual terms. He followed the footsteps of Virginia Woolf and others, and Russian artists like Vasily Kandinsky, the latter an exponent of abstract expressionism. Now, today, when we are talking about a kind of a radical sensibility, literary sensibility, which is aligned to mysticism and spirituality, it might really appear to be outlandish because of the dominance of the secularism, for example. I mean, the opposite of secularism is not non-secularism, it's not communalism, but spirituality of a certain kind. And the spirituality, which is all-encompassing and which, sort of includes the major religions of the world. At the heart of every religion is a spiritual kind of a truth. And I think it speaks very well of James Cousins and others, that they were really in quest of that kind of a spiritual truth. And they thought that that could be the basis for creating a kind of a literary and poetical order of the future itself. And now I shall also give you towards the end the reasons as to why that project, for example, had to be shelved and why it did not really fructify in the long run. Now, I will just give you 2 or 3, for example, quotes from Sri Aurobindo to tell you as to why he thought that Cousins' really influence was pivotal. And this is what he reads this book, New Ways in English Literature, where, for example, Meredith and Stephen Phillips and Tagore and Sri Aurobindo are included. So through this kind of anthology making, he is creating a kind of a new canon. And Sri Aurobindo reads this, and he was writing. He was the editor of Arya, along with Paul Richard. And this is what he says. It matters very little to me what Mr. Archer, John Woodruff's unnamed English professor, might say. But what is very important to me is that what Nietzsche has to say, what Schopenhauer has to say, what thinkers like Cousins, for example, have to say. Now, he was obviously, he like Cousins and Tagore, they're tapping the idealistic tradition, which goes back to Plato, in contrast to, for example, the empirical, the positivistic kind of a tradition, which is there in Aristotle, for example. Now, if you think that the trajectory of the West, if they had followed, for example, Plato, they would have really arrived at one set of consequences and implications, but they follow Aristotle. Sri Aurobindo is following the tradition of Nietzsche, the tradition of Schopenhauer, the tradition of people like Cousins and Tagore also. And there is a confluence of many minds there, which is really not talked about. And which is why I think it's important to reclaim and recuperate that kind of a tradition, because that was an attempt to really create an alternative kind of a tradition, which was there. Now, there are other extracts also I want to really bring in, but lack of time doesn't permit me. Just one or two examples, for example. Now, one is that he is invited to come to Adyar. Then he goes as a principal, Cousins goes as a principal to the Theosophical College at Madanapalli. Now, Madanapalli was a very important destination at that time, but it's completely forgotten now, in the Chittoor district of Andhra Pradesh. And then something incredible happens. I mean, every day, and I'm sure at the end of today's program also we'll have a national anthem, but nobody knows where it was composed. Nobody knows who gave the tune to the national anthem. It is Tagore who gave the tune, and the composition took place in Madanapalli and in the presence of James Cousins and Margaret Cousins. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to share this passage with you. And this is the picture, this is the portrait. If you can see, this is the portrait. Can we have myself? Now I am seeing only Anis on this thing. Can we have? I think, you know, the webmaster, Vermaji, I think I should be visible. Yes.
No, it is
Vermaji,
visible, sir.
It is visible. It's visible.
Yeah.
Visible, yes.
It should be visible.
Yeah.
Can we see me? Can we see?
Yeah, of course.
Yes. Then please request the webmaster, the administrator, to put me there on the. So you can see that this is the painting of James Cousin in 1920, done by Mira Alfasa, who later on becomes the lead disciple of Sri Aurobindo and becomes the mother of Sri Aurobindo Ashram. So she was a very gifted painter. This is 1920. Now I'll just read out a paragraph about how, for example, the composition really took place there, and I think it's worth remembering. In Madanapalli, for example, how that composition really took place. In a voice surprisingly light of so large a man, he sang something like a piece of geography, giving a list of countries, mountains, and rivers, and in the second verse, a list of religions in India. The refrain to the first verse made us prick up our ears. The refrain to the second verse made us clear our throats. We asked for it again and again, and before long, we were singing it with gusto. Jai Hai, Jai Hai, Jai Hai, Jai 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 Hai. So you can see that this is the anthem which is composed, and the tune has been given by Margaret Cousins. Don't you think it's something incredible? And that all of us need to know? It's not just a question of giving legitimacy to an alternative kind of a sensibility that they were trying to do, but the composition. And Tagore has been invited to go to Madanapalli and says that I'm trying for so long, but it's like knocking in Bengali. It is like saying that knocking on the door of death, for example. But he eventually goes there, and this is the very fruitful kind of an interaction that happens. And both James and Margaret Cousin, they also visit, before going to Japan, they visit, Shantiniketan, and then there has been a fruitful interaction. Now I come to the second and the final part of my talk. And now I would like to really talk about two important, critics and the poets. One is, I would like to refer to the debate which took place in the 50s and 60s between P. Lal / Raghavendra Rao versus Buddhadeva Bose. I think Buddhadeva Bose was very important. And, it's a very complex kind of a personality, literary personality. I won't say a problematic kind of a personality, but a complex personality. And in the case of Buddhadeva Bose, you find that here is a person who is a product of Dhaka University in both English as well as Bengali. And then he teaches English literature, and he is an exponent. He is acknowledged as the major exponent of bringing modernism, literary modernism in Bengali after Tagore, for example. And he is the founder of the Department of Comparative Literature in Jadavpur University. Now, he engages in a very serious debate with P. Lal, who was the founder of the Writers' Workshop. And I think the debate was about whether India should write in English or not. And the point that Buddhadeva Bose was making, that almost in a condescending manner, he was saying that we are aware of the fact that there is a kind of a group of people under the leadership of P. Lal. They have created a workshop, literary workshop, and they are writing. And he's not very impressed by the kinds of an effort which is really being made there. And in contrast to that, and he says, allow me to just quote. And then in response to that, you have, P. Lal and Raghavendra Rao, in their introduction to the edition, they condemn Buddhadeva Bose and say, and they're saying that Sri Aurobindo is responsible for writing greasy, weak-spined, and purple adjectival spiritual poetry, and the blurred, rubbery sentiments of Sri Aurobindo, and declared that the phrase of Indian English and Indo-Anglian romanticism ended with Sarojini Naidu. They advocated a vital language which must not be total travesty of the current pattern of speech. So I think what they were trying to really do is to advocate the language written by the common people, ordinary folks, for example, the language which deals with everyday life, the language of quotidian life, the language which is recognizable by the ordinary people, in contrast to the high romanticism that you find in Sri Aurobindo. And then immediately after that, in the 60s, you find late 50s and early 60s, we have Nissim Ezekiel, R. Parthasarathy's 10th, 20th century poets, and of course, Arun Kulachkar and many others who are writing poetry of this kind, the new poetry, influenced by T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, the Imagistic School, and many others. So what has really happened now is that the experiment which was tried out by James and James Cousins, Sri Aurobindo, and Buddhadeva Bose has really not fructified. And what takes its place is, of course, what is known as modern poetry in the Western context. And a similar kind of experiments take place in our own context, for example. If you look at, and one other important milestone that I would like to really suggest, Buddhadeva Bose, has an entry to the Encyclopedia of English and American Poetry. And this is where, for example, he's attacking the group represented by P. Lal and the modernists. And if you see the writing of Nissim Ezekiel, subsequently the writing, Nissim Ezekiel is defending the cause of the Indian English writers. And then he is, of course, attacking, Sri Aurobindo and Sarojini Naidu and others. But one of the things that I found again and again, because while the importance of using the language of the ordinary people, the language which is recognizable and familiar to all of us, is very well taken, I think singling out, a person like Sri Aurobindo, poet like Sri Aurobindo, and equating his poetry only with one text, I think it is unfair. I think all of them, early Pilal, as well as Nissim Ezekiel and R. Parthasarthi and others, for example, Arvind Kishan Mehrotra, are singling out one text of Sri Aurobindo, and that text is Savitri. But if you look at the nature of the poetry that Sri Aurobindo wrote, right from Urvashi, which had a kind of a concreteness and sensuousness, Urvashi, to, for example, the last sonnets that he wrote, for instance, or a poem like Dream of Surreal Science, which is full of wit and humor, you find that that kind of an equation is not really correct. And it is true that for some reason, Savitri becomes so important for the reason that it was the last work that he did. He also said that it is a magnus opus. He also said that he is not likely to find the appreciation in terms of poetic sensibility, because the early poetry of his, early writing, he says, is influenced by the Edwardian kind of a sensibility. And the later poetry is the poetry of the future. And that is why he wrote the future poetry. And I want to suggest that future poetry, where he has given importance to the English romantics, etc. And he was saying that they are the harbingers of the kind of a sensibility of the future, which will be rooted to mysticism and spirituality of the world, not just India. That is something of the future. So Sri Aurobindo says, I fall between two stools. One is the credo which I have left behind in England, and like Manmohan Ghosh, for example. But Manmohan Ghosh remained with the British writers, with the Irish writers. And then he, of course, with the Greek classics, he does not really go. But if you look at Sri Aurobindo's work, if you look at the work that he did towards the end, for example, whether it is essays on the Gita or the Life Divine, for example, each epigraph is from the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Gita. So he is a person who has changed, and he's making a certain experiment, not just in Savitri and elsewhere, for example. He's making an experiment which brings a powerful and substantial allusions to the Indic tradition itself. I think, if you look at the assessment and the critique that people like Nissim Ezekiel and the others are making, they have a point. And this point or two have been acknowledged by Buddhadev Bose, but I think they're going overboard by equating Sri Aurobindo's poetry only with Savitri, exclusively with Savitri. Sri Aurobindo has a corpus of poetry, as I said, with last sonnets, etc., with Urvashi and Love and Death, for example, which are powerfully capturing the experience of the ordinary men and women, for example. It is not just nebulous. It is not ethereal. It is not abstract. It is very concrete. The kind of a concreteness that poets like A.K. Ramanujam and R. Parthasarthi, etc., we're talking about. Let me come to the very end of the presentation, and thank you for your patience. And I'm going to conclude what I am going to say. If you look at the beginning itself, right from the beginning, if you see that Indians are influenced, and in this deliberation, we also saw the examples of how Indians are going to the West, and they're being influenced, but they're retaining a kind of a uniqueness of their own, because this is a powerful engagement that India is doing with the West. In some instances, completely going overboard and becoming Anglophile. In some instances, retaining the kind of an Englishness, because I think the changes which are coming from outside, there is a selective appropriation which is taking place. In the hands, Tagore goes to England, but he's not completely colonized. Subhash goes to the West and he stands fourth in the ICS, he's not colonized. Sri Aurobindo goes to the West and he's not colonized, he gives up the ICS. I think it's very important. Access to the English language is a passport to the international kind of a communication and discourses. This kind of a discourses, may I suggest, does not take place in the case of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who is a nativist. Sri Aurobindo is not a nativist, he's a polymath. He's a cosmopolitan, like Tagore. Tagore was a cosmopolitan. Sri Aurobindo was a cosmopolitan. And James and Margaret Cousins were cosmopolitan. So their literary and cultural quest was not confined to Bengal, not confined to India. They were pan-Indian, pan-Asian, and pan-world. So when Sri Aurobindo is writing, he's not writing for Indians or the Bengalis alone, because he doesn't believe in that kind of an anthropocentrism. He's thinking about the whole humanity and mankind. So when he's using the Miltonic words, for example, he says that English language is a very important passport to the international discourse. And this is something which has to be really kept in mind. In other words, what I'm suggesting here is to make a nuanced approach in understanding how canon making takes place. If you go back to 1970, for example, the first important book that I really read was Richard Oman, English in America, then Gerald Graff, Literature Against Itself. And in 90s also, The Lie of the Land, for example, Indian English critics were trying to really define what should be taught in the Indian classroom. I'm suggesting that whether you like it or not, it is important to really recognize the major contributions which James Cousin had made. And we have to read against the grain the contribution of James Cousins, Tagore, Sri Aurobindo, and others. You might have a preferred kind of a worldview, literary worldview and sensibility. But I think literary facts, as they have taken place, in terms of the construction of the canon, is very important to bear in mind. And we really, and we cannot really afford to have this kind of an amnesia with regard to the defining and this rediscovery of the canon that we have in mind. So I think the main point that I wanted to make, and I do hope that I have been able to really make that point, is the uniqueness, not just of what he did, in becoming, for example, the president of the Art Society in Chennai. Those are very important. The composition, that is also equally important. But what is sufficiently not known is the contribution that James Cousins had made with regard to the defining of the Indian canon. And that canon, of course, is superseded later on by the Indian modernists. But nevertheless, at a certain period, for 50 years, for example, they had a living presence. And I think you will agree that it is important to really reclaim that kind of a knowledge for our own sake itself. Because although, for example, we know that it doesn't really move in a linear manner, and there are gaps also. And I think what I was trying to do today is to rediscover that gap. And I would like to suggest that rediscovery for ourselves, for our students, will be very fruitful in understanding the Indian sensibility and Indian writing in English. And today, fortunately, we don't talk about Indian writing in English. As David McCutcheon had once, sarcastically, ironically said, like a dog walking on both on hind feet, for example. But Indian writing in English and writing in general has acquired its own kind of a status and legitimacy. But I think we need to really have a more complex and more nuanced and more sophisticated approach of understanding the canon of the Indian writing in English. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty. I think you have projected a number of issues. In short, I can say that you have presented an agenda for our literary studies in modern times. Lots of things we have covered, and I was reminded of many of the things that we have mentioned, especially with respect to Nishikolo and Sri Aurobindo. Strangely enough, Nishikolo said at one point of time, and famously, he said that anyone who has a taste for the language of Sri Aurobindo has no taste for the English language. So these are the controversies that are there, and the time gap and the lag that we have talked about, and the new directions that English literary studies should take place, all these things taken into consideration. Here's an agenda in your talk that one needs to take. So sorry that there is no time, actually. Time left is actually we have finished the time given to us, but we have one more presentation. And not the least, but the valuable last, I would say, is the presentation by Usha Bhinde, Dr. Usha Bhinde. I would request her to be as brief as possible because we have already crossed the time of 5 o'clock. It is 5:05 already. She's a former fellow of IIAS Shimla and a visiting professor of Vishwa Bharati University, teaches at Government College for Women in Shimla, worked as principal of Government College in Arki, and associated with the Institute of Integrated Himalayan Studies in Himachal Pradesh, Shimla, where she worked on 4 major projects there. And she has a number of research papers to her credit and lectured on skill developments, etc. Narrative spaces, she's going to talk about very briefly about the female spaces with reference to narrative spaces and mountain spaces. And she has got a text in hand about which, and she's going to relate her talk to the text that she has in hand. I would request you, Dr. Usha Bhinde, to please come and be as brief as possible. My apologies in advance for saying so, but time constraint is there. Actually, I had said that we'll save some time for discussion or interaction that may not be possible, but maybe a few words at the end I would. So Usha Bende.
Thank you, Professor Rama. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
And I thank the Sahitya Academy for bringing us all together, old friends, and of course, new bright scholars I have seen. I feel very happy, and without much ado, I start. I have given a very ambitious title to my paper, but this I will probably be only touching a little bit because in the passing, I am talking about two travelogues of by women. We know very well that travel means risk, travel means adventure, and particularly it means venturing into the unknown. So, as Susan Bassnett puts it, it is hardly surprising to find that early travel accounts tended, for the most part, to be written by men who moved freely in public sphere. Yet, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, many women also traveled, and some of them wrote their accounts, very we can say hair-raising account of their travels. In this paper, I wish to study two texts by two women travelers, Penelope Chetwood and Christina Noble, who were drawn to the wonder of the Himalayas, that they dared across the inhospitable terrain. Chetwood was not a mountaineer in the strict sense of the word, but Christina was. Christina was from Scotland, who came with a trekking expedition, fell in love with the Himalayas, made Manali her home, and married an Indian professor who was at that time teaching in Himachal Pradesh University. Later, she stayed among the Gaddis for 1 year. That was in 1970s. Penelope Chetwood was the daughter of British Commander-in-Chief of India during the 30s, and she had, just 1 second, she had trekked with her mother in 1933 to Kullu. She felt so drawn by that she came in 1960 and she wrote a book. I show it. Kullu, the End of Habitable World. Christina Noble also wrote At Home in the Himalayas. Both these works are literary, highly literary value they have got. They show historical, cultural, ecological, and human understanding of nature. At that time, in the 60s in particular, Himachal was not at all explored as it is today. Now, negotiating the gray areas between power and desire, the two travelogues are set in India of 1960s and 70s respectively. Although these two women loved India and loved the Himalayas, but they could not play down their separate identity. Penelope Chetwood, who had witnessed the colonial era and the power of colonialism, she says in her travelogue that sometimes she used to act like a real Ao Jao Mem Saab. She quotes Ao Jao Mem Saab. And Christina Noble also says that people were so taken aback by in the 70s, people were very simple over here, and that they were in awe of the white, and her children, two children, they got preferential treatment in Kullu school. She calls it moral outrage. However, both were secretly, they were enjoying their power, that colonial power. Penelope also records at one place when she shouts at a muleteer. She writes with remorse later on, if you shout at the Indian servant and throw your weight about, they crumble up at once and you enjoy the sense of power. That is residue of colonialism. Despite their white female identity, people looked at them, they were observed rather. I have given the title Female Space. They were observed, and they, instead of becoming observer, they were observed. For the local, Christina was just a hippie in trouser and kurta. That was the time when lots of hippies were coming to Kullu Manali area. Penelope Chetwood records, As an English meme sahab, riding a mule is a freak, an anachronism in India of the 1960s. Again, women traveling alone are not without their hazards. At one place, she records, people were generally respectful to her. But in the 60s, things had changed. That was not like the 30s when her father was the commander in chief. Now, one forest officer who was sent as her security by the forest department, he behaved very badly with her. Actually, he tried to get into the room at night. And as you know, the government rest houses, they don't have proper latches and all that. She had a great trouble. She narrates it very beautifully. But in the morning, when she writes about it, she makes it very light. Uh, the narrative space and the colonial space overlap in Penelope's Kullu, the end of habitable world. She says, while one part of me was longing to discover new India, the other part was nostalgic about the time my father planned our trek, and it was meticulously planned. I am leaving out certain things to shorten it. In otherwise, also mine is only 12 minutes. Christina Noble's At Home in the Himalayas is also set in Kullu Manali region. As the blurb on the book proclaims, it is both an irresistible autobiography and a magical portrait of Kullu life. She records her experiences as a mother, as a wife, as a hippie turned housewife, and all that. Her stay with the Gaddis in another book, she writes about 1 year spent among the Gaddis. They are the tribals living in the high reaches of Himalayas, and she has given very authentic information about this tribe, which was not otherwise easily available. Of course, some of the British travelers, they have written about the Gaddis, but this is her woman's point of view. One endearing quality of these travelogues is their narrative exuberance and spontaneity. They read like novels. Finer sentiments have been expressed in a language that lies between Victorian passion for stylish prose and modern unembellished simplicity. The actual physical journey is the chief matter, with little or no metaphoric meaning, yet it can be literary and allusive. There are beautiful passages of natural scenery, awe-inspiring deep valleys, eerie heights, routes made through the passes and formidable rivers. But at the same time, there is also a feeling which Wordsworth otherwise calls a kind of presence in the mountain that both of them feel. So at one place, Penelope writes, it was a dramatic landscape of huge, smooth boulders with the roaring river rushing among them. For Christina Noble, spending a night in a smoke-filled hut was an experience in itself. For Chetwood, just huddle under the huge boulder umbrella can be a spiritually barren physical endurance test. The structural framework of the travelogues also work at several levels of inclusion and exclusion, time and space, as the female gaze travels inside the homes. Now, travel narrator female have got, women have got this advantage. They write about the social injustices, women's experiences in the other culture, detailed description of customs, religious practices, habitat, and dress. They admire and appreciate the beauty of women. Penelope Chetwood was so taken aback by the rustic beauty of Mrs. Shai, wife of one of the residents there, that she writes, when an Indian woman is, I quote, when an Indian woman is beautiful, she is more beautiful than any other woman in any other race. For it is not her features only which are perfect, but the rhythmic grace of her every movement. This Christina Noble, Penelope Chetwood, they became very friendly with the locals. And they have given us cultural aspect of the hill communities. Both are attracted to Hindu gods, Hindu myths. There is Hidimba temple in Manali. this Duff Dunbar house was a famous landmark for both of them. Penelope Chetwood's greatest contribution lies in the field of documentation of the temples of entire Kulu Valley, except Harcourt, who was a assistant commissioner in Kulu. Nobody had done it so far till the 60s. Now, of course, lots of material is available. Likewise, Christina Noble shows great faith in Hidimba Devi. So her detailed and elaborate account of Hidimba is, of course, gives us great insight into the temple, its architecture, its mythical importance and all. The travelogues throb with life because of the people who flit in and out of these pages with grace. I don't name all the people, but I will say that these people, both the women, were very friendly with the Christian community there. But at the same time, Penelope Chetwood devotes a complete chapter to a hill princess. She has a dialogue with her, and we know much about the royal household of Kulu region. So again, I have cut short. Chetwood's book ends with a kind of moral lecture to the muleteer who to be kind to animals. Christina looks at changes in lifestyle of mountain people philosophically and writes that, quote, new values alter traditional relationships. In this area, a lot of changes are there. So the narratives agree that mountain travel requires physical and mental vigor. It allows no passivity. And above all, mountains harbor no preposterous assumptions. They are the primeval, elemental force and need to be respected as such. Here, the mountain spaces and the narrative spaces coalesce as the writers instinctively understand that speaking about narrative space makes little sense without considering the place within it and the writer's relationship with them. Thank you. I don't know how much time I took, but
thank you very much. Thank you very much, and for being so considerate. Now, Mr. Verma, what do you say?
No, you first give your comments. At least brief, sir.
Yeah, sure.
In brief.
I know that brevity is very important.
Yeah.
Friends, I had promised that we shall have a little discussion also, but sorry that there's no time for that. So on behalf of all of us, let me propose a few things that might be of some use. The basic idea behind holding a symposium or a conference or a seminar is that we test our hypothesis there. Every presentation is a kind of a blueprint which later develops into a full-fledged paper of research which you publish and ultimately contribute to the broader body of knowledge. What we have done here today is also that we have tested our hypothesis in relation to the non-fiction writing, which has been neglected rather, as has been mentioned in the earlier versions also, earlier talks also. So here we have had an occasion to test so many hypotheses in relation to autobiography with travel writing, personal narratives, communal narratives, and etc. That brings me to say that all these were very well structured presentations, without doubt. And these were essential texts, very quintessential texts that you had chosen, and every speaker had at least 1 or 2 or 3 texts to refer to. So if you look at the totality of the text that we have discussed today, they create a panorama for us to look into the variety and the greatness and the comprehensive variety, I would say, of the non-fiction prose writing, especially with reference to the Indian writing, so to say. These are personal and communal narratives of great significance, well structured, so to say. And then what we all need to do is that we need to relate all these structures of narrative with the dynamics of time, when and what for and in which situation they were written. What was the historical context of those? What were the cultural correlates of those? What were the political underpinnings behind? But more important than that is also the method of reading. How do we approach a particular text apart from the time space that we have in mind to be able to relate with? and the history that it reflects in some way or the other, and the cultural constructions that it represents, or the political configurations that it represents. So all these representations that we find in the non-fiction prose, they need a method of reading. This method of reading, there are too many methods of reading available to us, the modern student, to the modern reader, to the modern scholar, and we have been engaging with all that in the classrooms and otherwise also. How to look at a text. There are so many, I need not go into those details, but the structures of the narrative have to be taken into account with reference to the modes of reading that we choose for ourselves. For example, we have also talked here of the poetics of the non-fiction writing and the poetics of the fiction writing. So we need to look into it a little more elaborate, in a little more elaborate fashion. How does, because it was also mentioned in the beginning, how do the genres cross borders, how fiction and non-fiction cross borders, how one becomes the other, how the migration of genres takes place. So with reference to the fiction and the non-fiction, we have to look at the two poetics that comes into our mind. Fiction literature is the imaginative. We often say that, going back to the Aristotelian concept of literature as being the imaginative reconstruction of reality. So looking at that, we might also propose that if that is the imaginative reconstruction of reality, this is an imaginative reconstruction, not an imaginative reconstruction, but a historical reconfiguration of the prose narratives that we have in personal and the personal and the communal narratives. So the research, this I understand this exercise that we have had for about 2 hours and more, 3 hours or so, opens ways for us to concentrate, to look further, to look beneath, and to find out if there are newer areas of research available for us. I understand personally that there are areas of research for us here. Quite a few ideas, very germinal ideas also have been presented, important ideas that we can develop later, and that is the basis of what we hold a seminar or a conference. So this opens ways, to my understanding. It has given me a few thoughts that would help me think afresh of non-fiction prose writings, and with reference to time, place, politics, etc. Opens new areas of research, because research these days in Indian universities has certain tracks, and it also falls within the category of the comparative studies very clearly, also in translation studies, because we have talked of translation and comparative as well. So it goes into the broader framework of the post-colonial studies, because area studies are important for us. The studies of anxieties and of the miseries and of the concerns of the communities. So this forms a major part of the post-colonial studies as such. So newer areas have come forth before us. This is symptomatic of the times in which we live, and therefore we need to pay attention to these, rather than to take on to very, very stereotypical. We have all, I think almost we have come out of the stereotypical thesis that we have been writing all these years, especially for the past 2 decades or more. So this is the time in which we need to look at it with greater objectivity, and look at the future prospects of how the universities, our universities, can look at the research prospects and how these can be of some use there. Thank you, Sahitya Academy. Thank you, Varmaji. Thank you, all the friends here, the panelists here. Very sorry for not being able to give you time enough. There are constraints in every seminar, it happens, so this is no exception. And I'm sorry personally for stopping you in between, if at all I did that. Yes, I did that. So sorry for that, but I understand our meeting was of some use, and you will be able to take home something from here and think further of your studies that you have made, and fine tune it, and to be able to think afresh further this direction. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Anisur Rahman sir, for chairing and conducting the session so beautifully and so well. I thank all of you honorable speakers on behalf of the Sahitya Academy for sparing your valuable time and participating in this lively session. I also thank all those who joined us in this program. We look forward to meet you again. Namaste and thank you very much.
Varmaji, the time constraint was there and your face was there before me. So I also ran very fast. So I could have spoken this at leisure in about half an hour, but I drove at the 100-kilometer speed. Thanks a lot.
No, it went off very well, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.